My name is Charmaine, and I am 34 years old. My stepmother came to visit the house my father had supposedly bought for me. My younger sister started arranging rooms for her family and demanded the keys. I stood up with a smile and said something that made their world collapse. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever stood up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. Growing up in our affluent suburban neighborhood meant portraying an image of absolute perfection. But inside our sprawling home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. I was the rebellious daughter who walked away from a prestigious university to build a career in private equity. My half-sister Alicia was the golden child. She became a pediatrician, married a wealthy white man, and never missed a chance to look down on my life choices. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 months after my father Winston passed away. I was standing in the kitchen of my modern custom-built home, pouring a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. I had fought for this quiet life, away from the constant judgment of Patricia and Alicia. The heavy oak front door suddenly burst open without a single knock. I set my coffee mug down as Patricia and Alicia marched right into my foyer. Behind them, two hired movers were carrying large stacked cardboard boxes. Alicia strutted straight into my living room and tossed her heavy designer bag directly onto my custom velvet sofa. She did not even look at me. Patricia walked right past the kitchen island, completely ignoring my presence. She pulled a metal measuring tape from her pristine leather purse and began measuring the width of my custom window frames. "This space is far too dark," Patricia announced, adjusting her silk scarf. "We will need to replace these heavy drapes with something lighter. The lighting in here is atrocious for entertaining guests." "What exactly are you doing in my house uninvited?" I asked, crossing my arms. Alicia finally looked up from her phone, letting out a loud, exasperated sigh. "Stop playing dumb, Charmaine," Alicia snapped. "Hand over the spare keys right now. Preston and I are taking the master bedroom upstairs. The natural light up there is much better for my morning routine, and Preston needs the attached office for his remote trading days. Mom is taking the guest suite on the main floor. You can pack up your things and move down to the finished basement. It has a separate entrance, so you will not disturb us when you leave for work." I stared at her, letting the sheer audacity of her words hang in the silent air. They had walked into my home, ordered movers to bring their boxes, and assigned me to my own basement all within 60 seconds. "I am not giving you any keys, Alicia. You have exactly 2 minutes to tell those movers to put your boxes back in their truck before I have them cited for trespassing." Patricia dropped her measuring tape, letting it clatter loudly against the hardwood floor. Her face contorted into the familiar mask of righteous victimhood she had perfected over the last 15 years. "How dare you speak to your sister that way?" Patricia shrieked. "Your father just died 3 months ago. I am a grieving widow. This house is family property. Your father paid for this place using funds from his logistics company. That makes it marital property, which means it belongs to me. You are nothing but a selfish, ungrateful freeloader trying to steal from a mourning woman." Alicia moved to stand beside her mother, shaking her head in manufactured disgust. "You really have no shame, Charmaine," Alicia added, stepping closer. "You dropped out of a respected university. You threw away a real education to work some generic corporate desk job. Dad bought you this house because he pitied you. He knew you would never land a husband to provide for you. You owe this family for carrying your dead weight. Hand over the keys right now and stop trying to rob my mother of what is legally hers." I did not raise my voice or cry. I simply looked at the two women who had spent my entire life making me feel like an unwelcome guest. They truly believed I was a helpless failure, living off a generous handout. They had no idea who I actually was, or what I had been building in the shadows. Before I could explain exactly why they were making the biggest mistake of their lives, a shadow fell across the entryway. Preston walked through the open front door. My white brother-in-law was dressed in his signature tailored gray suit, looking every bit the arrogant Wall Street investment banker he prided himself on being. He had a smug smirk plastered across his face. In his right hand, he held a thick yellow legal envelope, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. He looked around my beautiful home with greedy, assessing eyes. We tried to do this the easy way, Charmaine Preston said, his voice dripping with unbearable condescension. But since you want to be difficult, we can do it the hard way. He tossed the heavy envelope onto my kitchen island. I have the official eviction notice right here, Preston continued, stepping forward to stand protectively in front of his wife. Winston signed the original property scouting paperwork before he died. That proves his corporate funds were involved. If you do not hand those keys to my wife right now, I will call the police and have you physically dragged out of here for unlawful detainer. Do not make this ugly, Charmaine. You do not have the money or the intelligence to fight my legal team. I looked at the envelope, then at Preston, then at Patricia and Alicia, who were both grinning with triumphant malice. They thought their privilege and their lies had finally won. I smiled warmly, picked up the legal envelope, and tossed it straight into the garbage can. Call the police, Preston, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Call them right now. Let us see exactly whose wrists end up in handcuffs when I show them the actual deed to this property. My stepmother stood in the center of my custom-built living room, clutching a metal measuring tape and loudly announcing her plans to tear down my imported silk drapes. Beside her, my younger sister threw her designer maternity bag onto my pristine velvet sofa and held out her hand, demanding the spare keys to the house I had secretly owned for 5 years. They thought because I was the unmarried college dropout of the family, they could simply evict me and claim my sanctuary as their own. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark roast coffee, smiled at the 2 women who had tormented me my entire life, and prepared to deliver a single sentence that would financially ruin them both forever. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit the subscribe button if you have ever had to teach toxic family members a painful lesson about underestimating your worth. Growing up in an affluent suburban neighborhood outside of Atlanta meant our lives were completely defined by keeping up appearances. My father, Winston, was the founder of a massive regional logistics empire. To the outside world, we were the picture of Black excellence. But behind the heavy oak doors of our sprawling estate, the reality was a suffocating environment of emotional manipulation and relentless conditional love. I was always the scapegoat. I was the rebellious daughter who walked away from my prestigious, historically Black college during my junior year because I realized the traditional path they forced upon me was destroying my mental health. When I left school, my father was furious, but my stepmother, Patricia, was absolutely delighted. She used my departure as the ultimate weapon to cement my status as the family failure. Meanwhile, my younger half-sister, Alicia, was the undisputed golden child. She did everything according to Patricia's perfect script. Alicia went to medical school, became a pediatrician, and married a wealthy white investment banker named Preston, who loved to weaponize his corporate privilege at every family gathering. For years, I endured their condescending remarks, their passive-aggressive jokes at Thanksgiving dinners, and their constant reminders that I was nothing more than a disappointment who worked a generic desk job. They had absolutely no idea that after dropping out, I had aggressively taught myself finance, worked 90-hour weeks, and quietly built my own private equity firm from the ground up. It was a rainy Tuesday morning, exactly 3 months after my father, Winston, passed away from a sudden heart attack. I was standing in the kitchen of my modern luxury home, enjoying the rare peace and quiet of my sanctuary. The trauma of the funeral and the subsequent chaotic family gatherings had left me completely drained. I was just pouring a fresh cup of coffee when the heavy front door burst open without a single knock. The jarring sound echoed through the hallway, making me jump. I stepped out of the kitchen and froze. Patricia and Alicia were marching right into my foyer, their designer heels clicking loudly against my hardwood floors. Behind them, 2 hired men in matching uniforms were carrying large, stacked moving boxes straight into my home. Alicia strutted past me without even saying hello and tossed her heavy leather handbag directly onto my custom sofa. Patricia walked right past the kitchen island, completely ignoring my presence, and pulled a metal measuring tape from her pristine purse. She immediately began measuring the width of my expensive window frames, pulling the tape with aggressive, sharp movements. "This space is far too dark," Patricia announced loudly, adjusting her silk scarf as if she already owned the place. "We will definitely need to replace these depressing drapes with something lighter." The lighting in here is absolutely atrocious for entertaining guests, and I refuse to host my book club in a cave. I stood there gripping my warm coffee mug, trying to process the sheer audacity of the home invasion happening right before my eyes. "What exactly are you doing in my house uninvited?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm and level. Alicia finally looked up from her smartphone, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh that she had perfected since childhood. "Stop playing dumb, Morgan," she snapped, rolling her eyes. "Hand over the spare keys right now. Preston and I are taking the master bedroom upstairs. The natural light up there is much better for my morning routine, and Preston needs the attached office for his remote trading days. Mom is taking the guest suite on the main floor. You can pack up your things and move down to the finished basement. It has a separate entrance so you will not disturb us or our guests when you leave for whatever little job you are doing these days." I stared at my younger sister, letting the absolute disrespect of her words hang in the silent air. They had walked into my private residence, ordered movers to bring their heavy boxes, and assigned me to my own basement, all within the span of 60 seconds. They truly believed I was a helpless failure living off a generous family handout. "I am not giving you any keys, Alicia," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "You have exactly 2 minutes to tell those movers to put your boxes back in their truck before I have them cited for trespassing and illegal entry." Patricia dropped her measuring tape, letting it clatter loudly against the floor. Her face instantly contorted into the familiar mask of righteous victimhood she had weaponized over the last 15 years. "How dare you speak to your pregnant sister that way?" Patricia shrieked, clutching her chest dramatically. "Your father just died 3 months ago. I am a grieving widow holding this family together. This house is family property. Your father paid for this place using funds from his logistics company. That makes it marital property, which means it belongs entirely to me. You are nothing but a selfish, ungrateful freeloader trying to steal from a mourning woman." Alicia moved to stand beside her mother, shaking her head in manufactured disgust. "You really have no shame, Morgan," Alicia added, stepping closer and pointing an accusing finger at me. "You dropped out of Spelman. You threw away a real education. Dad bought you this house because he pitied you. He knew you would never land a successful husband to provide for you. You owe this family for carrying your dead weight all these years. Hand over the keys right now and stop trying to rob my mother of what is legally hers." I did not raise my voice or shed a single tear. I simply looked at the two women who had spent my entire life making me feel like an unwelcome burden. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and greed that they could not see the trap they had just walked into. They had no idea who I actually was or what kind of financial empire I had been building in the shadows while they were busy playing dress-up at the country club. Before I could explain exactly why they were making the biggest mistake of their lives, a tall shadow fell across the bright entryway. Preston walked through the open front door. My white brother-in-law was dressed in his signature tailored gray suit, looking every bit the arrogant Wall Street investment banker he prided himself on being. He had a smug, condescending smirk plastered across his face. In his right hand, he held a thick, yellow legal envelope, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. He looked around my beautiful home with greedy, assessing eyes before his gaze finally locked onto mine. "We tried to do this the easy way," Morgan Preston said, his voice dripping with unbearable superiority. "But since you want to be difficult, we can do it the hard way." The room went completely still at my challenge. Preston stood there, his smug smile faltering as his eyes darted from my face down to the black leather folder I had pulled from my briefcase. He was used to people cowering when he threatened legal action. He was used to his tailored suits and loud voice commanding immediate submission, especially from black women. But I was not one of his terrified interns or a naive client. I was the architect of my own empire. I slid the heavy folder across the smooth surface of the marble kitchen island. The leather made a soft scraping sound in the quiet room. "Go ahead, Preston," I urged, gesturing toward the document. "Open it. Read the details aloud for my sister and my stepmother. I want them to hear exactly who owns the ground they are standing on." Preston scoffed, adjusting his tie in a pathetic attempt to reassert his dominance. He picked up the folder with exaggerated boredom, but his fingers were gripping the edges too tightly. He flipped it open, and his pale blue eyes began scanning the official county property deed. I watched his face closely, waiting for the exact moment his inflated ego shattered. It took 10 seconds. His jaw tightened. The arrogant flush in his cheeks drained away, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He read the document a second time, his eyes moving frantically across the heavy stock paper, as if hoping the words would magically change. "What does it say, Preston?" Patricia demanded, her voice echoing shrill and incredibly impatient across the bright open space. "Stop stalling and tell her to pack her bags right this instant. This is my house. Winston bought this beautiful property specifically for family use, and as his widow, I am clearly the primary beneficiary." Preston did not look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the paper. "This does not make any sense," he muttered, his voice losing all its previous bravado. "The deed is not in my father's name. It has never been in his name." Alicia stepped forward, snatching the folder out of her husband's hands. "What are you talking about, Preston?" she snapped. "Of course it is in Dad's name." She looked down at the document, her eyes narrowing as she read the bold print at the top of the page. "This says the property belongs to Apex Holdings," Alicia read aloud, confusion masking her usual arrogance. "What is Apex Holdings? Dad owned a logistics company, not a holding firm. This has to be a mistake or some kind of fake document you printed out to stall us." "There is no mistake," I replied, leaning casually against the counter. "Apex Holdings purchased this property entirely in cash 5 years ago. The transaction was clean, fast, and completely off the radar of my father's traditional business accounts. I made sure of it because I knew this exact day would come. I knew the moment my father was gone, the two of you would try to circle like vultures and pick my bones clean." Patricia crossed her arms, her designer rings clinking together. "Well then, who owns Apex Holdings?" she demanded, tapping her foot on the floor. "If Winston set up a shell corporation to hide assets, I am still entitled to them. I am his sole legal heir. Everything he built belongs to me now." I let out a low, genuine laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of my living room. I reached out and tapped the bottom of the deed, right where the corporate officer's signature was clearly printed. "Winston did not set up Apex Holdings," Patricia the First explained, watching the realization slowly creep into their eyes. "I did. I am the founder, the sole chief executive officer, and the 100% owner of Apex Holdings. This house does not belong to the estate. It does not belong to a family trust. It belongs to me. It has always belonged to me." The silence that followed was absolute perfection. The two movers, who were still standing awkwardly by the front door, slowly lowered the heavy boxes they were carrying, setting them quietly on the floor. Even they realized the situation had just violently flipped. Patricia's face turned a dangerous shade of red. The veins in her neck strained as she struggled to comprehend what I was saying. "You are lying," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the walls. "You are a college dropout. You are a glorified secretary working a pathetic desk job. There is absolutely no way you could afford a multi-million-dollar estate in cash. You stole this. You embezzled funds from your father's logistics company to fund this fake corporation." Alicia nodded vigorously, stepping up beside her mother. "That is exactly what happened," she yelled, pointing at me. "You stole from Dad. You siphoned money out of his accounts because you knew you were a failure and could never make it on your own. We are going to expose you, Charmaine. We are going to take everything from you." Preston seemed to recover some of his false bravado, stepping forward to join the attack. "Embezzlement is a severe federal crime, Charmaine," he said, attempting to sound authoritative again. "If you diverted corporate funds into a personal shell company, you are looking at years in prison. We will call forensic accountants. We will audit every single ledger your father ever touched. We will drag you into court and absolutely destroy you." I did not flinch at their threats. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I just let them scream and accuse and threaten because I knew exactly how hollow their words were. They had built their entire identities on the illusion of limitless wealth and power, completely unaware of who was actually pulling the strings behind the curtain. "You are going to sue me, Patricia?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You are going to hire forensic accountants and expensive corporate lawyers to drag me into federal court and destroy my life?" "Yes, I will," Patricia screamed, spit flying from her lips. "I am the widow of Winston. I have his entire estate at my disposal. I will bury you in legal fees until you are begging me for mercy on the street." I slowly lifted my left arm and casually checked the time on my diamond watch. It was exactly 10:45 in the morning. "Sue me with what money, Patricia?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "What are you talking about?" Patricia scoffed, clutching her expensive leather purse tightly against her chest, as if to protect her imaginary wealth. "I have millions of dollars sitting in the bank." "No, you absolutely do not," I replied very softly. "Because your black premium credit card was literally just declined at the luxury department store exactly 10 minutes ago." The silence in the room was so profound that the sudden buzzing of Patricia's phone sounded like a fire alarm. It vibrated aggressively against the marble countertop where she had set it down next to her measuring tape. She snatched the device up with a trembling hand, her manicured fingers swiping across the screen. I watched her face drain of whatever color it had left. Another buzz followed immediately after the first, then another, and another. A rapid cascade of notifications chimed through the kitchen. Each sound was an alert from a different financial institution. American Express, Chase, First National, all sending automated messages of declined transactions, overdrawn accounts, and suspended credit lines. Patricia stared at her screen, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to comprehend the barrage of digital rejections. She looked like a fish gasping for air. "This is a mistake," she stammered aggressively, tapping the screen as if pressing the glass harder would magically restore her fabricated wealth. "There must be some sort of error with the estate accounts. Winston always kept everything properly funded. Preston, call the bank right now and tell them to fix this immediately." Before Preston could even reach for his phone, another ringtone pierced the tense atmosphere. This time it was Alicia. The upbeat pop song she used as a ringtone felt entirely out of place in the heavy air of my kitchen. She pulled the phone from her maternity bag, glancing at the caller identification with a frown. "It is the Porsche dealership," she muttered, her confusion evident. "Why would they be calling me on a Tuesday morning?" She answered the call, putting it on speakerphone out of pure habit. "Yes, this is Dr. Alicia," she answered, emphasizing her title as she always did. The voice on the other end of the line was polite, but incredibly firm. "Hello, Dr. Alicia. This is the financing department at the dealership. We are calling to inform you that the lease payment on your luxury SUV is now officially in default. The automated transfer scheduled for this morning was returned for insufficient funds. If the balance of $4,000 is not paid by the end of the business day, we will be forced to initiate repossession protocols." Alicia scrambled to take the phone off speaker, pressing it tightly to her ear. Her eyes darted frantically toward Preston, who was staring at her in absolute shock. "That is impossible," she hissed into the receiver, walking a few paces away toward the dining room. "There is plenty of money in that trust account. You need to run the routing numbers again." I picked up my coffee mug, feeling the comforting warmth of the ceramic against my palms. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the rich flavor of the dark roast, as the two women who had tormented me my entire life panicked in my kitchen. The movers had completely vanished, slipping out the front door, silently sensing that a massive family implosion was taking place. "You can stop yelling at the poor dealership employee. Alicia," I said, my voice steady and calm. "Running the routing numbers again will not do you any good. The account is completely empty." Alicia ended the call, her face twisting into a mask of pure rage. She marched back over to the kitchen island, slamming her phone down next to the garbage can where her fake eviction notice currently resided. "What did you do, Charmaine?" she demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. "Did you hack into Dad's accounts? Are you manipulating the estate funds? Preston, she is committing wire fraud. Do something." I set my coffee mug down, resting both hands flat on the cool marble counter. "I did not hack into anything, Alicia." I simply logged into my own administrative portal and turned off the valve. I took a deep breath, letting the reality of the moment settle over them. For the past 4 years, I have been the sole benefactor of the Winston Family Anonymous Trust. That trust is what paid the lease on your luxury cars. That trust is what funded Patricia's endless shopping sprees and her ridiculous country club membership. That trust paid for your weekly spa treatments, your designer clothes, and the very bag you just threw on my sofa. Patricia gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. "That is a lie," she whispered, though the fear in her eyes told a completely different story. "Winston set up that trust to care for us. He told me he secured our future." "Winston did not have the capital to secure anything," Patricia corrected gently. "His logistics company was bleeding money for years before he died. He was drowning in corporate debt and trying to keep up appearances. When he finally realized he was going to lose everything, he came to me. The college dropout, the disappointment, the daughter he hid away from his high society friends. He begged me to help him maintain the illusion of your perfect lives. So I set up the trust through Apex Holdings. I have been funding your entire existence out of my own pocket. But since you decided to march into my home and attempt to evict me, I decided my charity work was officially over." Preston stood completely frozen, his financial brain quickly doing the math. He was looking at his wife as if he did not know her at all, realizing the massive fortune he thought he married into was nothing but a complete fabrication. Alicia shook her head violently, refusing to accept the truth right in front of her. "You are lying," she sneered, stepping closer to the island. "You are a bitter, jealous liar. Dad paid for my entire medical school tuition. He bought the commercial building for my pediatric clinic. He funded my startup costs. He was a proud, successful Black man who provided for his family. He would never let a failure like you fund my life. You could not possibly have that kind of money anyway. You are just trying to mess with our heads." I looked at my sister, listening to her desperately cling to the false narrative of our father's supreme power. She wanted so badly to believe that the golden child had been elevated by the king of the family and that I was still just the dirt beneath their expensive shoes. I reached into my briefcase one more time. I pulled out a second document. This one was older, printed on slightly yellowed paper and bound with a heavy staple at the top corner. I placed it gently on the marble counter right next to the deed of the house. I did not push it toward them, but I left it close enough for them to see the bold black lettering at the very top of the page. "I was not the one who paid for your medical school, Alicia," I said, my voice dropping to a somber, serious register. "But I do know exactly where the money came from. Why do you not take a very close look at these hospital papers from 5 years ago?" Alicia stared at the yellowed document sitting on the cold marble counter. Her perfectly manicured fingers hesitated for a long moment before reaching out to touch the fragile pages. I watched her eyes slowly scan the top of the form where the bold black letters spelled out a legal transfer of assets. Patricia stepped closer, her breathing suddenly becoming very shallow and incredibly fast. 5 years ago, I was working 3 different jobs just to keep a roof over my head. I was taking night classes and working double shifts because my father had completely cut me off financially at your demand. My body simply gave out. I collapsed at work and woke up in a sterile hospital room connected to an intravenous drip. I remember the sheer physical exhaustion weighing down my bones, making it impossible to even keep my eyes open. I remember the harsh fluorescent lights and how vulnerable I felt lying in that scratchy hospital gown with monitors beeping around me. And I remember you, Patricia. I remember you walking into my quiet hospital room wearing a pristine cashmere coat looking entirely out of place. You did not ask the attending doctors how I was doing. You did not ask me if I was in pain or if I needed anything to drink. You walked right up to my hospital bed and pulled a thick stack of papers from your expensive designer bag. You put a pen in my trembling hand and told me the hospital administration needed a signature for a standard medical consent form so they could run more tests and keep me overnight. I was heavily medicated, running a severe fever and barely conscious. I trusted you because despite all the emotional abuse, you were still my father's wife. I signed the papers blindly because I was far too weak to read the fine print. But it was not a medical consent form, was it, Patricia? I tapped my index finger firmly against the documents on the kitchen counter. It was a complete legal waiver. You tricked me into signing away my entire inheritance from my grandfather. You stole the heavy trust fund he set up specifically for me, and you used every single penny of it to pay for Alicia's pristine medical clinic. You used my money to fund the very luxury life Alicia is bragging about right now while I was struggling to pay for basic groceries. Alicia gasped, taking a sudden step away from her mother. She looked at Patricia with wide, confused eyes, her mouth hanging slightly open. "Mom, is this true?" Alicia asked, her voice trembling with rising panic. "Did you steal her trust fund to pay for my clinic?" Patricia did not answer her daughter. Instead, a look of pure feral desperation crossed her perfectly contoured face. She lunged forward across the wide kitchen island, her manicured hands grasping wildly for the yellowed documents. Her sudden aggressive movement knocked over a heavy glass vase, shattering it into dozens of sharp pieces across the hardwood floor. "Give those to me!" Patricia screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet house. "You have no right to keep those. You stole them from my private files." I swiftly pulled the leather folder out of her reach, sliding it smoothly down the long counter where she could not grab it. "I did not steal anything, Patricia. These are certified legal copies provided directly to me by the estate attorneys. You owed this family," Patricia yelled, her face turning a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. "You were a complete disgrace to our name. You dropped out of a prestigious college and brought massive shame to our entire social circle. Your father was humiliated by your actions. You did not deserve a single penny of your grandfather's hard-earned money. You were a failure working miserable little desk jobs while we had a reputation to maintain. Alicia was the one actually making something of herself. Alicia deserved that clinic and that money. You owed us for carrying your dead weight and keeping your pathetic failures hidden from all of our important friends." She lunged again, her nails scratching against the smooth marble surface, trying to reach across the island. I stood my ground, looking down at the woman who had manipulated my darkest and weakest moments for her own greedy benefit. She was practically foaming at the mouth, completely stripped of her usual high society elegance and reduced to a scrambling thief. That is when Preston decided to intervene. He stepped heavily over the shattered glass on the floor, using his tall, broad frame to try and intimidate me. He puffed out his chest and marched right up to the edge of the kitchen island. His face was set in a hard, aggressive scowl, meant to put me firmly in my place. "Listen to me very carefully," Charmaine Preston said, his voice dropping into a low, threatening rumble. "You are playing a very dangerous game with people who have far more power and influence than you could ever imagine. I do not care what kind of fake corporate company you claim to own. You are going to hand those hospital documents over to Patricia right now. If you do not, I am going to walk around this counter and physically take them from you myself. You do not want to test me." He stepped even closer, invading my personal space, trying to force me to back down through sheer physical intimidation. He was so used to women shrinking away from his anger. He was completely used to his corporate bullying tactics, working flawlessly against people he considered beneath his status. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked straight up into Preston's cold blue eyes and held his gaze with absolute, unwavering authority. "If you take one more step toward me, Preston, I will have you arrested for assault before you can even reach the end of my driveway," I said, my voice slicing cleanly through the heavy tension in the room. "You are standing in my house threatening me over legal documents that expose your mother-in-law for federal fraud. Do you really think your precious Wall Street firm is going to keep you on the executive payroll when your name is dragged into a massive family embezzlement scandal?" Preston stopped dead in his tracks. His jaw clenched tight, but he did not take that extra step forward. The mention of his valuable firm and his fragile corporate reputation was the only thing that could pierce through his arrogant armor. He slowly backed away, raising his hands in a gesture of false surrender, but his eyes were filled with furious venom. Patricia was hyperventilating now, leaning heavily against the edge of the counter. "It does not matter what those papers say," Patricia gasped, struggling to catch her breath. I transferred that money 5 long years ago. It is completely gone and spent. The statute of limitations protects me, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to reverse the transaction now. The money is mine and the clinic belongs to Alicia. You cannot touch us. I looked at Patricia, feeling a deep, overwhelming sense of total satisfaction settling into my bones. The massive trap had been set years ago, and she had walked right into it without ever bothering to look down. I slowly closed the leather folder and smoothed my hand over the dark cover. You really should have read the fine print before you forged a medical waiver, Patricia, I said, shaking my head in quiet pity. Granddad knew exactly what kind of greedy, manipulative woman you were. He knew you would try to bleed the family dry the moment you had the chance. So he had his corporate lawyer include a very specific fraud penalty clause in the master trust agreement. Patricia froze, her entire body going stiff as her eyes locked onto mine with sudden paralyzing terror. What clause? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own rapid breathing. The clause that states any beneficiary who attempts to illegally alter, forge, or steal from the primary trust immediately forfeits their own shares, I explained, watching the last bit of color drain completely from her face. By tricking me in that hospital room, you triggered the absolute penalty, Patricia. You did not steal my trust. You legally forfeited your own. Patricia stood there resembling a shattered porcelain doll. Her perfectly painted lips trembled, but absolutely no sound came out of her mouth. I leaned forward, resting my weight against the cool marble of the island, making sure she heard every single word of her own financial execution. When you took that forged medical waiver to my grandfather's estate attorneys 5 years ago, you thought you had pulled off the perfect crime. You thought because I was physically exhausted and sick in a hospital bed, you could just sweep my legacy into your own accounts. You assumed you were smarter than everyone else in the room. But Granddad was a highly paranoid man, and his lawyers were explicitly instructed to verify any transfer of assets directly with me in person. The very moment they saw that fraudulent document, they knew it was a fake. They initiated the fraud penalty protocol immediately without giving you any warning. According to the ironclad terms of the Master Trust Agreement, any attempt to bypass the primary beneficiary results in the complete and total forfeiture of all remaining assets tied to the offender. That meant your share, Patricia. That meant the vacation homes, the luxury vehicles, the massive stock portfolios Winston thought he had safely secured for you and your future. The second that fake waiver was scanned into their system, the trap snapped shut forever. 100% of my grandfather's wealth was legally routed directly into my private offshore accounts. It has been sitting there quietly multiplying for the last 3 years while you lived entirely off the secret financial grace of Apex Holdings. I watched Patricia grasp her chest, her breathing turning into shallow, ragged gasps. She looked around the beautiful, bright kitchen, as if the walls were suddenly closing in on her, crushing her lungs. "You mean the money is actually gone?" She choked out, her voice sounding incredibly hollow and weak. "Everything I had, everything Winston promised me is just gone forever." "It was never truly yours to begin with, Patricia," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level and devoid of any sympathy. "You spent the last half-decade parading around exclusive country clubs and hosting lavish charity galas, pretending to be the untouchable queen of a logistics empire. You thought you were spending old family money, but you were actually living on an allowance I graciously provided so my father could die with his pride completely intact. I funded your pathetic illusion of wealth. I paid the exorbitant bills you could not afford to cover. I kept this family from sinking into total public bankruptcy. And the very moment Dad was put in the ground, you decided to repay my silent generosity by trying to kick me out of my own private sanctuary." The sharp sound of something heavy hitting the floor broke the thick tension in the room. Alicia had dropped her designer maternity bag. The expensive leather slapped loudly against the hardwood floor, spilling a gold-plated compact and a set of luxury car keys near her feet. She was staring at her mother with an expression of absolute profound horror. "You are broke," Alicia whispered, her voice quickly escalating into a hysterical shriek. Mom, tell me she is lying to us. Tell me we still have the trust fund money. Tell me my pediatric clinic is not funded by her. Patricia could not even look at her golden child. She just covered her face with her trembling manicured hands, letting out a pathetic sobbing sound that echoed terribly through the open living space. She looked small and entirely defeated. Alicia completely lost whatever fragile composure she had left in her body. Her face contorted into a hideous mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She began pulling at her perfectly styled hair, her pristine professional image shattering into a million pathetic pieces right before my eyes. She turned her vicious rage away from me and directed it entirely at the woman who had raised her to believe she was utterly untouchable. How could you be so incredibly stupid, Mom? Alicia screamed, stomping her foot on the floor like a spoiled, furious toddler. You ruined everything we built. My friends at the club are going to laugh at me behind my back. Preston and I are going to lose the massive house, the expensive cars, the entire clinic. You told me Dad left us a fortune. You told me Morgan was just a broke dropout who we were going to kick to the curb today. You made me look like an absolute idiot. I am supposed to be the successful one in this family. I am a respected doctor. I am not supposed to be the pathetic charity case living off the sister I deeply despise. I stood there quietly, letting Alicia's vicious meltdown wash over me. For years, she had paraded her medical degree around like a heavy weapon, using it to bludgeon my self-esteem at every Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner. She had mocked my clothes, my job, and my life choices without mercy. Now the glorious realization that her entire privileged existence was subsidized by the sister she called a failure was tearing her apart from the inside out. But the dramatic performance was not over yet. Preston, who had been standing silently near the edge of the kitchen, suddenly stepped forward. His face was no longer pale and shocked. It had turned a deep, violent shade of crimson. The horrible realization that he had married into a broke family, that his beautiful trophy wife was entirely dependent on the woman he was just trying to intimidate, had pushed him past the point of corporate composure. He marched right past his hysterical crying wife, completely ignoring her tears, and slammed both of his heavy hands down onto the marble island. The sudden violent movement made my coffee mug rattle loudly against the stone, but I did not blink or step away. You think you have won this little game? Preston snarled, his voice vibrating with aggressive masculine rage. You think because you have some hidden offshore accounts and a dummy holding company you can just humiliate my family and walk away clean? You are playing a very dangerous game, Morgan, and you have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I looked at him, mildly amused by his sudden outburst. And who exactly am I dealing with, Preston? A mid-level investment banker whose wife cannot even afford her luxury car lease payment. His pale eyes narrowed into dangerous, aggressive little slits. You are dealing with a senior vice president of Sterling Financial. Preston spat his chest, heaving with angry exertion. And since you want to pull back the curtain and talk about dirty family secrets, let us talk about your beloved father. Let us talk about his precious logistics empire that you love so much. You said he was drowning in corporate debt. Well, guess who holds the primary debt for Winston Logistics? Guess which major investment firm currently owns the massive commercial loans that are keeping your father's legacy barely afloat? He smiled, a nasty, victorious grin slowly spreading across his red-flushed face. My firm holds the paper, Morgan. Sterling Financial owns the primary debt on the warehouses, the transport trucks, the shipping contracts. Your father signed away his entire company to us, just to keep the lights on during his last 2 miserable years. I remained perfectly still, letting him lay out his grand, threatening strategy without interrupting him. You might own this fancy house, Morgan. Preston continued, leaning closer so I could feel the heat radiating off his angry body. You might even have your grandfather's trust fund hidden away in some tropical tax haven. But your father's company, the very legacy he spent his entire adult life building, belongs completely to me. And if you do not sign this house over to Patricia right now, if you do not restore Alicia's funding immediately, I will destroy everything Winston ever worked for. Preston reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored gray suit jacket and pulled out his sleek smartphone. He unlocked the screen with aggressive sharp taps, holding it up high so I could clearly see the corporate contact list displayed on the bright screen. "I am going to call my boss right now," Preston said, his thumb hovering dangerously over the glowing glass screen. "I am going to initiate the severe foreclosure protocols. I am going to liquidate your father's logistics company before the end of the business day. I will tear his legacy into tiny little pieces and sell them for scrap. You will all be out on the street." Preston tapped the screen of his phone with aggressive and sharp movements. He was completely blinded by his own masculine rage and his desperate need to regain control of a room that had thoroughly slipped from his grasp. He wanted to punish me. He wanted to see me beg for my father's legacy. I simply stood there and watched him swipe through his contacts until he found the name of his managing director. Alicia had stopped crying for a brief moment, her tear-stained face looking up at her husband with a sudden spark of renewed and pathetic hope. She wiped her eyes, sniffing softly as she stepped closer to his side. She truly believed her knight in shining armor was about to slay the dragon and hand her back the keys to her privileged kingdom. Patricia leaned against the marble counter, breathing heavily, but managing a cruel little smirk. They both thought Preston held the ultimate trump card that would finally force me to my knees. He pressed the call button and immediately engaged the speakerphone, setting the volume to maximum so his absolute power could echo off the high ceilings of my living room. The phone rang once and then twice. The sound was loud and clear in the dead silence of the kitchen. Preston puffed his chest out, adjusting his posture to look as tall and commanding as possible. He looked at me with cold blue eyes that promised absolute financial devastation. He was ready to play God with what he thought was my only weakness. He genuinely believed that the logistics company was the one thing I still cared about in this world. The line clicked open, and a frantic voice echoed through the speaker. "Preston, is that you?" the voice demanded, breathless and practically vibrating with an unnatural level of panic. The background noise of the call was completely chaotic, filled with shouting voices and ringing desk phones. Preston did not even notice the sheer terror in his boss' voice. He was far too wrapped up in his own arrogant performance. "Yes, Richard, it is me," Preston announced loudly, making sure to enunciate every single syllable for my benefit. "I am calling to officially instruct you to initiate immediate foreclosure protocols on the Winston Logistics accounts. I want the entire debt portfolio liquidated before the market closes today. We are calling in all the loans effective immediately and stripping the corporate assets down to the bone. Sell off the trucks and empty the warehouses." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The sound of papers shuffling frantically in the background filtered through the speaker. "Preston, what in the world are you doing?" Richard yelled, his voice cracking with a level of stress I had rarely heard from a seasoned Wall Street executive. "Shut up right now. Shut your mouth and listen to me before you get us all completely destroyed." Preston's smug smile froze on his face. His thick blonde eyebrows pulled together in deep confusion. The arrogant posture he had just assumed began to visibly deflate as the harsh tone of his managing director cut through his manufactured authority. "Richard, what are you talking about?" Preston asked, his voice losing its booming resonance and dropping to an uncertain mutter. "I am telling you to execute the liquidation on the Winston accounts. We hold the primary debt. We have the leverage to crush them today." "We do not hold anything anymore, you absolute idiot!" Richard screamed through the phone, the sound echoing painfully off the marble countertops. "Are you even looking at your internal corporate emails this morning? Have you checked the executive dashboard in the last 2 hours? We do not own the Winston debt portfolio. We do not own the commercial loans. In fact, we barely even own ourselves right now." Alicia let out a soft, confused gasp, stepping closer to the phone, her hands hovering near her chest. Patricia stared at the device as if it had just grown fangs, her cruel smirk completely wiped away. Preston just stood there, blinking rapidly, his mind entirely unable to process the words coming out of the speaker. He looked down at the phone and then back up at me, searching for some logical explanation. "What do you mean we do not own the debt?" Preston asked, his hands beginning to tremble slightly. I personally oversaw the Winston Logistics profile. I manage those commercial loans. I am the senior vice president of that division. Not anymore, Richard barked, his voice tight with pure, unadulterated fear. A massive private equity firm just executed a hostile buyout of our entire distressed debt division. They swept in an hour ago and bought the portfolio at an unbelievable premium. It was a cash transaction, Preston, a complete and total blindside. They did not just buy the Winston debt. They bought out the board. They own the firm upper management. They are currently restructuring our entire executive suite as we speak. We are bleeding executives right now, and nobody knows who is going to survive the purge. The silence in my kitchen was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a massive explosion. Preston looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. His face was completely bloodless, his mouth hanging open in a silent shape of pure terror. The firm he worshipped, the corporate ladder he had spent years ruthlessly climbing, had just been ripped out from under him in a matter of seconds. Who? Preston whispered, his voice cracking pitifully. Who bought the division? Apex Equity. Richard replied, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. Some massive ghost firm out of nowhere. We do not even know who the regional directors are yet, but their legal team is sitting in my office right now reviewing every single executive contract. If they hear you are trying to initiate unauthorized liquidations on accounts they now own, we are both going to be terminated and blacklisted from the financial sector forever. Do not do anything stupid, Preston. I let the pathetic silence drag on for exactly 3 seconds. I took a slow, casual step toward Preston, looking down at the phone, trembling in his sweaty palm. I cleared my throat, a soft, polite sound that made Preston jump as if he had been struck by lightning. Hello, Richard, I said, speaking clearly and calmly toward the phone. There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. Who is this? Richard asked, his voice shaking with intense caution. This is Morgan, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured and incredibly smooth. The Chief Executive Officer and sole founder of Apex Equity. And I would really appreciate it if you could tell your Senior Vice President Preston exactly what happens when he stands in my private residence and attempts to threaten his brand new boss. A sound resembling a choked sob came through the speakerphone. Richard was quite literally hyperventilating on the other end of the connection. Miss Morgan, he stammered, the authority completely stripped from his voice, leaving only a begging, desperate employee. I had absolutely no idea he was speaking to you. We were not informed of the structural changes yet. I assure you, Preston does not speak for the firm. He does not have the authority to liquidate anything. I am well aware of his lack of authority, Richard. I said, my eyes locked onto Preston's pale, terrified face. I just bought your entire division specifically to secure my father's legacy and protect it from greedy, incompetent middle managers like Preston. It seems my newly acquired vice president has severe boundary issues and a severe lack of professional judgment. Preston was visibly shaking now. The phone nearly slipped from his fingers. He looked at me with an expression of pure, absolute horror. The Wall Street bully who had spent the last 10 minutes threatening to put me on the street was now staring at the very person who held his entire career, his reputation, and his financial future in the palm of her hand. Alicia was clutching her stomach, backing away from her husband, as if he had suddenly caught a contagious disease. She finally realized that not only was her family broke, but her wealthy, successful husband was now entirely at my mercy. Patricia looked like she was going to pass out, her knees buckling slightly as she gripped the edge of the kitchen island to keep from falling. I expect a full review of Preston's employment contract on my desk by tomorrow morning, Richard, I instructed, ignoring the pathetic, whimpering noises coming from my sister. And please immediately revoke his access to the corporate servers and all client portfolios. I do not want him touching another financial document until I decide what to do with him. Yes, absolutely, Miss Morgan. Richard practically shouted through the speaker, desperate to save his own skin. His access will be terminated immediately. Consider it done. Thank you, Richard, I said softly. Have a wonderful afternoon. I reached over and tapped the red button on the screen, ending the call. The silence returned heavier and more suffocating than ever before. I looked at the three of them standing broken and utterly defeated in my beautiful home. The checkmate was complete, and they knew they had absolutely nothing left to play. The heavy silence in the kitchen only lasted for a few agonizing seconds before the sharp buzzing of Preston's phone shattered the quiet. He stared down at the expensive device still clutched tightly in his sweaty hand. The screen flashed bright white, displaying Richard's name once again. Preston looked at me with wild, terrified eyes, completely paralyzed by the sudden shift in power. He knew that answering that call would seal his fate, but he also knew that ignoring the managing director was corporate suicide. "Answer it, Preston," I commanded, my voice echoing cleanly off the marble counters. "Let us hear what the managing director has to say to you now." Preston's trembling thumb swiped across the smooth glass screen, and the speakerphone clicked back on. Richard did not even wait for him to offer a greeting. "Preston, you are officially terminated, effective immediately." Richard shouted, his voice completely devoid of the panic from earlier. It had been replaced entirely by cold, ruthless corporate self-preservation. "You have egregiously violated our core company ethics by attempting to leverage firm assets for your own personal vendettas against innocent private citizens. Furthermore, you directly threatened the chief executive officer of our new parent company while acting as a representative of this firm. Human Resources has already dispatched your official termination packet to your personal email address. Security is currently boxing up your desk, and you are permanently barred from entering any sterling financial building ever again in your life." Preston tried to speak, to formulate some kind of pathetic legal defense, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He just opened and closed his mouth like a suffocating fish. "Do not ever contact me or anyone else at this firm again," Richard snapped before the line went completely dead. The expensive smartphone slipped from Preston's numb fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud, cracking the pristine glass screen right down the middle. He just stood there staring at the shattered device as the absolute reality of his situation crashed down heavily on his broad shoulders. His entire identity was wrapped up in his prestigious Wall Street title, his tailored suits, and his arrogant corporate power. He had spent his entire adult life stepping on other people to climb the corporate ladder. He had mocked my modest lifestyle for years, believing his high salary made him a superior human being. In less than 5 minutes, he had been stripped of everything that made him feel important. I watched the arrogant white-collar bully completely shatter from the inside out. The rigid, dominant posture and aggressive, puffed-out chest vanished entirely. He ran his shaking hands through his perfectly styled blonde hair, completely ruining the expensive cut. He began to hyperventilate, pacing back and forth across the kitchen floor like a trapped feral animal, looking for a way to escape a burning cage. His breathing was loud and ragged, filling the large room with the sound of total masculine defeat. Then his wild, panicked eyes landed squarely on Alicia. My sister was still backed up against the luxury refrigerator, hugging her pregnant stomach and weeping silently into her hands. Preston stopped pacing and marched directly toward her. The raw, unhinged fury radiating off his tense body made Patricia physically flinch and take a quick step backward to protect herself. "You lied to me!" Preston screamed, his voice tearing through the kitchen like a violent crack of thunder. "You told me you came from old money, Alicia. You stood there at the country club and bragged to all my corporate partners about your massive family trust fund and your untouchable high society status. You convinced me that marrying into this family was the ultimate strategic move for my career and my financial portfolio. You made me believe I was marrying royalty." Alicia shrank away from his towering rage, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. "Preston, please stop. You are scaring me," Alicia begged, her voice trembling with pathetic desperation. "I did not know she was going to do this to us. I swear, I thought the money was completely secure. I thought my grandfather left it all to my mother." "You thought," Preston roared, stepping so close to her that she pressed her back flat against the stainless steel appliance just to get away from his spit. "You did not think at all, you spoiled, useless fraud. You and your psychotic mother dragged me into your miserable little family war, and now I am completely ruined. My entire career is gone, Alicia. The reputation I spent a decade building on Wall Street has been reduced to absolute ashes because you lied about your pathetic fake wealth. I am going to be blacklisted from every major financial institution in the country. He turned around and kicked a heavy wooden bar stool, sending it crashing violently against the marble island. Patricia let out a startled shriek, covering her mouth with both hands as the wood splintered. Preston was completely losing his mind, his carefully constructed country club facade peeling away to reveal the greedy, desperate opportunist he truly was beneath the expensive suits. "I married you because you were supposed to be a wealthy, prestigious asset," Preston yelled, pointing an aggressive, shaking finger at his sobbing wife. "You were supposed to elevate my status among the senior partners. Instead, you are nothing but a broke, pathetic liability. I am going to lose absolutely everything because of you. We cannot afford the mortgage on that massive estate without my executive salary and your fake trust fund. We cannot afford the luxury cars, the private club memberships, or any of the garbage you constantly buy to impress your fake friends. We are going to be bankrupt before the end of the year. Please, Preston, just calm down. We can figure this out," Alicia pleaded, reaching out a shaking hand to touch his tense arm. "We still have my pediatric clinic. The clinic is highly successful and brings in a massive profit every quarter. I treat all the wealthy families in the suburbs. We can survive on my income until you find a new firm. We just have to downsize for a little while and live off my medical practice. I am a respected doctor, Preston. I can support us." Preston swatted her hand away, as if she had just burned him with acid. "Your clinic?" He laughed, a harsh, maniacal sound that bordered on genuine madness. "You think your little suburban doctor office is going to support my lifestyle? You think you can pay for the massive debt we have accumulated with your basic pediatric appointments? You are completely delusional, Alicia. Your clinic cannot even cover the property taxes on our house." I stood near the edge of the counter, silently watching the beautiful, dramatic implosion of their toxic marriage. It was like watching a perfectly choreographed train wreck unfold in slow motion. They had built their entire relationship on a foundation of greed, lies, and superficial social status. The very moment the money was removed, their supposed love immediately turned into vicious, hateful resentment. They were finally seeing each other for who they truly were, and the reflection was absolutely hideous to witness. I slowly lifted my hands and brought them together. I clapped once, then twice, then a third time. The slow, sarcastic sound echoed sharply through the large kitchen, immediately cutting through their vicious, screaming match. Preston and Alicia both froze, turning their heads to look at me. Their faces were flushed red with severe anger and stained with desperate, humiliating tears. "Trouble in paradise?" I asked, my voice dripping with dark, cold amusement. It is so incredibly tragic watching true love fall apart over a few missing bank accounts and a terminated employment contract. But before you start depending on that lucrative little medical practice to save your miserable suburban lifestyle, you really should check your commercial lease agreements. Alicia stared at me, her chest heaving as a new wave of fresh paralyzing terror washed over her tear-stained face. "What are you talking about, Morgan?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own rapid, terrified breathing. I smiled, leaning forward slightly so she could clearly see the absolute total victory burning in my eyes. "Wait until Preston finds out who actually owns the building your pediatric clinic is leasing, Alicia." Alicia stared at me as the blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. "What are you talking about, Morgan?" she whispered, her voice shaking so badly she could barely form the words. I took a slow step forward, making sure she felt the full weight of my presence in the room. "I am talking about the pristine glass building downtown, where you run your prestigious pediatric clinic, Alicia. You see, about 6 months ago, my holding company, Apex Equity, quietly purchased that entire commercial block. It was a very simple cash transaction that went completely under the radar of the local real estate market. Since I am the sole owner of that building, that makes me your direct landlord." Alicia shook her head violently as if trying to physically reject the words I was saying. "That is impossible," she stammered, taking another step back until she hit the stainless steel refrigerator. Dad pays the lease for my clinic from his corporate accounts. He set up an automatic transfer years ago. The estate handles all of my overhead expenses so I can focus entirely on my wealthy patients. I smiled a cold, humorless expression that made Preston physically flinch and back away from his wife. Dad used to pay your lease, Alicia. But when his company started drowning in massive corporate debt, he quietly suspended those automatic transfers just to keep his own shipping trucks running. Your luxury clinic has not paid a single dime of rent in over 6 long months. Under normal circumstances, the property management group would have evicted you after 90 days. They would have locked the doors and seized all your expensive medical equipment. But since I owned the building, I instructed them to let the massive debt accumulate. I wanted to see exactly how long you would go without noticing that your perfect, successful medical practice was actually entirely bankrupt. I am initiating a total legal lockout this afternoon, Alicia. Your staff is being escorted off the premises right now. Preston turned his furious eyes on his wife, his chest heaving with deep masculine rage. You have not paid rent in 6 months, he yelled at her, his voice cracking with pure disbelief. You told me your clinic was generating massive profits, Alicia. You told me you were completely financially independent and that your practice was the crown jewel of the local medical community. You lied to me about everything. Alicia ignored her angry husband, her panicked eyes locked entirely on me. You cannot do this, Morgan, she pleaded, her voice rising into a desperate shrieking sound. You cannot shut down my clinic. I have elite patients who rely on me. I have a flawless professional reputation to maintain in this city. If you lock me out, you are not just ruining my medical career, you are actively destroying Black excellence. You are tearing down your own sister just to satisfy your petty, pathetic jealousy. How can you betray your own flesh and blood like this? The sheer, unmitigated audacity of her words made a bitter, heavy laugh escape my throat. I looked at the spoiled, arrogant woman who had spent her entire adult life treating me like gum stuck to the bottom of her expensive designer shoes. Do not you dare stand in my kitchen and lecture me about family loyalty. Alicia, I said, my voice dropping into a dangerous low register that commanded absolute silence in the room. Do not you dare try to hide behind the concept of Black excellence when you have spent your entire life stepping on my neck just to make yourself look taller. You want to talk about how we treat our flesh and blood. Let us talk about the summer charity gala at the Elite Country Club 3 years ago. Alicia swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward her mother, as she realized exactly what painful memory I was bringing up into the light. I had saved up my wages for months just to buy a decent evening gown so I could attend that charity dinner and support Dad. I continued watching the heavy guilt slowly wash over Alicia's terrified face. I walked into that grand ballroom, hoping to finally be accepted by this family. But the very moment you saw me talking to your wealthy high society friends, you grabbed my arm and pulled me aside into a dark hallway. Do you remember what you said to me, Alicia? Do you remember the exact vicious words you used when you kicked your own younger sister out of a public event? Alicia looked down at her expensive leather shoes, completely unable to meet my intense gaze. I was just stressed that night, she mumbled, her voice sounding incredibly weak and pathetic. I did not mean what I said, Morgan. I was just trying to protect my professional image. You told me I was socially unfit to be seen with your high society circle, I said, repeating the exact words that had burned a terrible hole in my heart for years. You looked me up and down with absolute unfiltered disgust and called me an ugly college dropout who was going to embarrass the family in front of your important medical colleagues. You told me to go find the service entrance and leave the building before anyone realized we were actually related. You humiliated me in front of half the city, Alicia. You stripped away my dignity just so you could protect your fragile fake reputation. So please do not stand there and demand sisterly compassion from the woman you threw away like absolute garbage. The heavy, tense silence returned to the bright kitchen. Preston looked at Alicia with complete disgust, finally seeing the ugly, cruel woman she truly was beneath her expensive clothes and her fancy medical degree. He took a large step away from her, physically distancing himself from the toxic, messy reality of her collapsing life. He realized he was shackled to a fraud. Alicia began to sob uncontrollably, sinking down against the refrigerator until she was sitting flat on the hardwood floor. She buried her face in her hands, crying loudly over her lost clinic, her ruined marriage, and her shattered public reputation. The pristine golden child of the family was finally sitting in the dirt where she belonged. That is when Patricia decided to intervene. She pushed herself away from the marble kitchen island, her face twisting into a severe mask of desperate maternal fury. She could not stand watching her perfect daughter fall apart, so she stepped forward, trying to reclaim the power I had just systematically dismantled. "You listen to me, Morgan!" Patricia screamed, her voice echoing shrilly against the high vaulted ceilings. "You think you hold all the cards just because you tricked Preston and bought Alicia's commercial building? You think you are invincible because you stole your grandfather's trust fund from my private accounts. But you are forgetting one very important detail, you arrogant little brat." I tilted my head slightly, watching Patricia puff up her chest in a final pathetic attempt to intimidate me with her false authority. "And what detail is that, Patricia?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm and amused. "I am the sole inheritor of your father's entire estate," Patricia declared, her eyes flashing with wild, desperate triumph. "Winston left absolutely everything to me in his master will. The house, the personal bank accounts, and most importantly, his entire logistics empire. I own Winston Logistics, Morgan. And since you want to play these ruthless corporate games, I will play them right back. I will sell the entire company to the highest corporate bidder by the end of the week. I will completely liquidate his precious legacy and use the billions to crush you and your little equity firm. I will tie you up in severe litigation for the rest of your miserable life." I looked at Patricia standing there in her expensive cashmere coat, radiating a false sense of absolute supreme authority. She truly believed she had just delivered the final crushing blow that would save her privileged, pampered existence. She thought she still held the ultimate weapon. I looked at her desperate, flushed face, and I just laughed out loud. I let the sound of my laughter bounce off the high vaulted ceilings of the kitchen. It was not a polite chuckle, but a deep, resonant laugh born from years of watching this arrogant woman parade around as if she owned the very air we all breathed. Patricia stood there completely paralyzed by my reaction. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the marble island so tightly that her knuckles turned a stark bone white. She had fully expected me to cower in fear at the mention of my father's logistics empire. She had expected me to beg her not to liquidate the company that bore my family name. Instead, I was looking at her with absolute pity. "What is so incredibly funny?" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking under the immense strain of her own rising panic. "I am talking about destroying your precious legacy, Morgan, and you are standing there laughing like a lunatic. I will sell every single transport truck and warehouse by Friday. You will have absolutely nothing left to hold on to." I slowly stopped laughing and let a chilling silence fall over the room once again. I looked at Patricia, my eyes locking onto hers with a predator gaze that made her physically shrink back. I reached out and rested my hand flat on the smooth leather surface of the folder sitting on the counter. "You are not going to sell Winston Logistics, Patricia," I said, my voice dropping into a deadly calm whisper that carried easily across the large open space. "You are not going to liquidate a single transport truck or sell a single square foot of commercial warehouse space. You are not going to call any corporate brokers or sign any executive transfer documents. And do you want to know exactly why you are not going to do any of those things, Patricia?" She stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her eyes darting nervously toward Preston and Alicia, who were both frozen in place. "Why, Patricia?" demanded, her voice losing its fierce edge and dropping into a pathetic, trembling squeak. "Because you cannot sell something you do not own," I stated simply. I opened the thick leather folder for the final time. I reached inside and bypassed the hospital records and the trust fund documents. I pulled out a single crisp piece of heavy legal paper. It was a certified notarized document covered in dark blue ink and stamped with a massive gold corporate seal. I placed my hand flat on top of the paper and slowly slid it across the smooth marble island until it came to a complete stop right in front of Patricia's trembling hands. I want you to read the heading on that document, Patricia, I commanded, leaning forward so she could see the absolute finality in my eyes. Read it out loud so your brilliant daughter and her highly successful Wall Street husband can hear exactly what it says. Patricia looked down at the paper. She did not want to read it. I could see her entire body rejecting the reality sitting right in front of her. But the morbid, terrifying curiosity was far too strong. Her eyes scanned the bold black letters printed at the top of the page. Bill of sale. Patricia whispered, reading the words as if they were written in a foreign language. Master transfer of corporate assets and primary ownership. I nodded slowly, keeping my gaze pinned entirely on her pale, terrified face. 2 years ago, my father came to my private office in the city. He looked incredibly old and completely broken. Do you know why he looked so defeated, Patricia? Because he had just spent 3 weeks quietly auditing the private corporate accounts for Winston Logistics. He had hired an outside forensic accountant because the numbers were simply not adding up. The company was generating massive revenue, but the operational accounts were constantly bleeding dry. He was preparing to lay off hundreds of loyal workers just to keep the lights on, and he could not understand why his empire was failing. Patricia let out a tiny, pathetic gasp, taking a sudden step backward. She shook her head side to side, but she could not look away from the document sitting on the marble counter. He found out everything, Patricia. I continued, letting my voice rise slightly to fill the heavy silence. He found the hidden transfer logs. He found the dummy accounts you set up under false vendor names. He realized that his beloved wife was systematically embezzling millions of dollars from his life work just to fund Alicia's high society lifestyle. He saw the exact paper trail connecting his dying company to your luxury vacations, your designer wardrobes, and the massive lease payments for Alicia's prestigious pediatric clinic. You were bleeding his legacy completely dry, and you did not even care that his business was collapsing around him. That is a lie, Patricia cried out, tears suddenly streaming down her perfectly powdered cheeks. Winston loved me. He wanted me to have those things. He gave me total access to the accounts because I was his wife. He gave you access to the personal accounts, Patricia. I corrected her, my tone turning sharp and ruthless. He never gave you permission to commit federal corporate fraud and drain the primary operational funds. When he saw the forensic audit, he was completely devastated. He knew that the moment he confronted you, it would trigger a massive public scandal that would permanently destroy the company name. He also knew that if he simply died and left the company to you in his will, you would liquidate his life work within a month just to maintain your country club status. He knew you would leave his loyal employees entirely jobless. Preston was staring at his mother-in-law with pure, unadulterated disgust. Alicia was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees, rocking back and forth as she finally realized her mother was nothing but a common thief. So my father made a desperate choice, I explained, pointing a firm finger down at the notarized document. He came to my office and begged me to save the company. He knew about my success with Apex Equity. He knew I had the massive capital required to quietly absorb the corporate debt and restructure the logistics network. So 2 long years before he died, Winston legally sold 100% of his company to my firm. Every single truck, every warehouse, every contract was transferred directly into my holding company. Patricia looked down at the paper again, her eyes scanning the bottom of the document, where my father's familiar signature sat next to mine. Look at the purchase price, Patricia, I commanded, watching her eyes widen in absolute horror as she found the bold printed number. My father sold me a multi-million-dollar logistics empire for exactly $1 single. He did it to ensure you could never touch his legacy again. He did it to protect his workers from your greedy, toxic hands. I watched the devastating reality finally crash down on her. The grand master plan she had relied on was nothing but a complete illusion. For the last 2 years of his life, my father was not the chief executive officer of Winston Logistics. I told her, letting the cold, hard truth sink deeply into her bones. He was essentially just a figurehead. He was my employee, Patricia. I paid his salary. I funded his medical treatments when he got sick. I kept the company running smoothly while he played his part to keep you entirely in the dark. Patricia let out a loud, agonizing wail that sounded like a wounded animal. She grabbed the edge of the counter, her legs completely giving out beneath her. She slid down the side of the marble island, collapsing onto her knees right next to the shattered glass on the floor. Her expensive cashmere coat dragged across the hardwood as she wept uncontrollably, holding her hands over her ears as if she could physically block out my words. You hold a will that leaves you the entirety of his personal estate. Patricia, I said, looking down at the broken, weeping woman who had tormented me for years. But you are a widow with absolutely zero assets. My father owned nothing when he died. The house belongs to me. The trust fund belongs to me. The logistics company belongs to me. Everything you thought you owned, every single thing you relied on to make yourself feel superior, belongs entirely to the stepdaughter you abused and threw away. You have nothing, Patricia. You are completely and utterly destitute. The heavy silence in the kitchen was broken only by the sound of Alicia's ragged, pathetic breathing as she knelt on the hardwood floor. Preston stood completely still. His mind was finally processing the absolute magnitude of the disaster. He looked at his mother-in-law weeping violently over her lost empire. He looked at his wife curled up against the luxury refrigerator sobbing over her bankrupt clinic. Then he looked at me standing tall and completely victorious. The realization hit Preston like a physical blow to the chest. He had thrown away his entire corporate career for a family of absolute frauds. His handsome face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. The charming country club smile he always wore was completely gone. He took a heavy step toward Alicia, looking down at her as if she were a piece of rotting garbage he had just scraped off his expensive Italian leather shoes. "You are nothing but pathetic ghetto trash!" Preston snarled, his voice dripping with venomous classism and deeply rooted racism. He began to pace back and forth across the kitchen, his white privilege completely unhinged now that the facade of their elite black wealth had been stripped away. I cannot believe I lowered my standards to marry into this miserable family. I actually convinced myself you were different from the rest of them, Alicia. I defended you to my wealthy conservative partners at the firm. I told them your family was civilized and respectable and firmly established in high society. Preston kicked another piece of shattered wood across the room, letting out a harsh, bitter laugh. "But you are just a bunch of desperate broke frauds playing dress-up in a stolen mansion," he shouted, pointing a furious finger at her trembling form. "You thought you could trap me with your fake trust fund and your imaginary corporate empires. You thought you could use my pristine Wall Street reputation to legitimize your pathetic social climbing. I bought you diamonds and luxury cars because you told me your inheritance would cover our future. You are an absolute parasite, Alicia. You are nothing but a common street hustler hiding behind a medical degree." Alicia gasped as the deeply racist and cruel insult struck her right in the chest. She scrambled across the hardwood floor, dragging her expensive maternity dress through the spilled water and broken glass. She ignored the sharp pain as glass tore into her knees. She reached out and grabbed Preston's tailored suit jacket, clinging to his arm with absolute humiliating desperation. "Please, Preston, do not say these terrible things," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, shrieking sob. "We can fix this together. We can start over from the beginning. I am still your loving wife. We are having a baby together. We built a beautiful life. Please do not leave me here with nothing. I will do whatever you want. I will work day and night to pay off our debts. Just please stay with me. I cannot face my friends if you leave me. I cannot be a single mother in poverty." Preston looked down at her clinging, manicured hands with pure revulsion. His eyes were cold and completely dead. He violently yanked his arm back, shaking her off with so much aggressive force that Alicia tumbled backward onto the hard floor. She hit the ground with a heavy thud, wrapping her arms around her pregnant stomach to protect herself. "Do not ever touch me again, you broke, pathetic liar," Preston shouted, stepping over her trembling body as if she were a disease. "I am calling my legal team the absolute second I leave this wretched house. I am filing for immediate divorce, and I am going to make sure the judge knows exactly how you and your manipulative mother systematically defrauded me." I am going to take whatever pennies you have left in alimony. You are going to rot in the slums where you belong." Alicia reached out a shaking hand toward him, her tears blinding her completely. "Preston, please," she wailed, her voice echoing miserably off the high vaulted ceilings. He did not even bother to look back at her. He did not grab his shattered smartphone from the floor. Preston turned his back on his sobbing pregnant wife and marched straight down the long, formal hallway. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind him with a massive echoing boom that vibrated through the entire foundation of the house. He was gone forever. He had completely abandoned her, leaving Alicia stripped of her precious high society marriage and her wealthy white savior. Alicia let out a harrowing, guttural scream that chilled the air in the room. She curled into a tight, pathetic ball on the kitchen floor, weeping so violently her entire body shook. The perfect golden child was entirely broken. Her wealthy husband had discarded her the exact second her bank accounts ran dry. She had sacrificed her own sister to maintain her luxurious facade. She had enabled her mother's toxic abuse just to stay in the spotlight. And now she was left with absolutely nothing but the cold, hard floor beneath her bleeding knees. Patricia slowly stopped crying. The sound of the front door slamming had snapped her out of her own miserable self-pity. She lifted her head from her hands and stared at her completely ruined daughter. She watched Alicia hyperventilate on the floor, abandoned and humiliated. Patricia realized that her entire master plan had failed spectacularly. The golden couple she had engineered to elevate her social status was totally and utterly destroyed. Her logistics empire was gone. Her immense wealth was a mirage. Her prestigious legacy was completely erased. She had spent decades building a kingdom of lies, and I had just burned it all to the ground in a single afternoon. Patricia slowly pushed herself up from the floor. Her joints popped as she stood to her full height. Her perfectly styled hair was a messy, tangled disaster. Her expensive designer makeup was smeared completely down her face, making her look like a deranged feral monster. She looked absolutely nothing like the poised, elegant matriarch she pretended to be. She turned her wild, bloodshot eyes slowly toward me. The sadness and defeat vanished entirely from her face. It was replaced instantly by a dark, murderous, unhinged rage. Her breathing grew heavy and rapid as she stared at the woman who had conquered her. All the hatred she had harbored for me over the years boiled up to the surface. I had taken her home, her money, her company, and her daughter's pristine future. Patricia did not say a single word. She took a slow, menacing step toward the counter. She slowly reached out her trembling hand toward the center of the marble island. Her manicured fingers wrapped tightly around the thick neck of a heavy solid lead crystal vase. Patricia lifted the heavy lead crystal vase off the marble island with both of her trembling hands. Her knuckles turned stark white under the intense strain of the heavy glass object. Her face was completely distorted by a wild, unhinged madness that erased any trace of the elegant society matriarch she used to be. The mascara streaked down her cheeks, making her look like a terrifying cornered animal. She raised the heavy crystal high above her head, her chest heaving with violent, ragged breaths. "I am going to destroy this entire house," Patricia screamed, her voice tearing through the kitchen like a jagged knife. "I am going to smash every single window and shatter every piece of expensive art you claim to own. I will take a hammer to the marble floors and tear the custom cabinets right off the walls. I will turn this pristine mansion into a pile of absolute worthless rubble. If I cannot have this house, Morgan, then neither can you. I will burn your precious inheritance to the ground before I let a pathetic little outsider kick me out onto the street." She took a threatening step forward, wielding the heavy vase as a weapon. She fully expected me to flinch. She expected me to raise my hands in fear and beg her to spare the expensive property. She wanted me to cower the same way I used to cower when I was a helpless teenager living under her tyrannical rules. I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still with my hands resting calmly at my sides. I looked at the heavy crystal vase hovering dangerously above my head, and I did not even blink. I just stared back into her manic, bloodshot eyes with absolute cold serenity. My complete lack of fear only seemed to infuriate her more. "Are you completely deaf?" Patricia shrieked, taking another aggressive step toward me. "I am going to obliterate everything in this room, Morgan, starting with that ridiculous custom refrigerator and ending with your skull." I slowly lifted my right arm and pointed my index finger straight up toward the ceiling. Patricia stopped in her tracks, her eyes darting upward following the direction of my hand. I pointed directly at the subtle recessed lighting fixtures installed above the custom cabinetry. I then pointed toward the discreet smoke detectors mounted near the massive archways of the formal dining room. I moved my finger to the small black circular nodes embedded perfectly into the intricate crown molding running along the perimeter of the entire kitchen. Patricia stared at the tiny dark nodes, her heavy breathing echoing loudly in the tense silence. She gripped the crystal vase tightly, but her aggressive forward momentum had completely stalled. "Do you know what those are, Patricia?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "When I officially took ownership of this property 2 years ago, I had a specialized security team come in and conduct a massive overhaul of the estate. I had them install high-definition hidden cameras equipped with advanced audio recording technology in every single room of this mansion." Alicia stopped sobbing on the floor and slowly lifted her tear-stained face to look at the ceiling. Her jaw dropped open in absolute horror as she suddenly realized the full implications of my words. "Every single threat you just screamed at me is currently being recorded in high-definition audio and video," I continued, my words slicing smoothly through their rising panic. "Every hateful word you used to describe my father, every detailed admission you made about embezzling corporate funds to support Alicia's fake pediatric clinic, your brilliant master plan to liquidate my logistics company, your violent threat to smash this house to pieces." Patricia slowly lowered the heavy crystal vase by a few inches, her arms shaking violently. Her chest was completely frozen as the terrifying truth began to settle deep into her bones. "The recordings are not just saving to a local hard drive inside this house," I added, offering her a dark, victorious smile. "They are being live-streamed directly to an encrypted cloud server. My private security team and my elite legal counsel are currently sitting in a corporate boardroom downtown, watching this exact conversation unfold in real time. They have been monitoring this feed since the very moment you and Preston decided to aggressively confront me in the foyer. They have documented every single threat of extortion and physical violence." Alicia let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine and buried her face in her knees. She knew exactly what this meant for her pristine public image. The recordings of her husband leaving her and calling her a broke fraud would be permanent legal record. Her admission that her medical practice was entirely bankrupt and relying on stolen funds was now securely in the hands of my ruthless corporate lawyers. She was completely and utterly destroyed. "You cannot use those recordings," Patricia stammered, her voice dropping into a desperate, pathetic whisper. "This is a private residence, Morgan. You do not have my legal consent to record my voice." "This is my private residence, Patricia," I corrected her smoothly. "And as the sole legal owner of this property, I have every right to monitor my own estate to protect my assets from violent, hostile intruders. You are currently trespassing on private property and threatening to cause massive physical destruction to my home. My legal team already has enough concrete evidence to lock you away in a federal penitentiary for corporate embezzlement. But now they also have pristine video footage of you attempting to commit felony destruction of property and aggravated assault." Patricia completely lost all of her remaining strength. The heavy lead crystal vase slipped from her numb, trembling fingers and crashed violently onto the marble floor. It shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, sending sharp shards flying across the kitchen tiles. The loud, explosive sound made Alicia scream and cover her head. Patricia did not even flinch. She just stared blankly at the ruined glass at her feet, looking completely hollowed out and utterly defeated. "You planned this from the very beginning," she whispered, her voice sounding incredibly old and exhausted. "You let us walk right into a trap." "I did not set a trap, Patricia," I replied, watching the final remnants of her pride turn to absolute ash. "I simply built a mirror and allowed you to look at your own hideous reflection. You destroyed yourself. You let your massive, uncontrollable greed blind you to the reality of the situation. You thought your white privilege and your fake social status made you completely untouchable. You thought you could continue to steal from my father and abuse me without ever facing a single consequence. The heavy, oppressive silence returned to the kitchen, broken only by Alicia's quiet, pathetic sobbing from the floor. Patricia stood there looking like a broken, hollow shell of a human being. She had absolutely nothing left to say. Her entire life was over. The massive fortune she thought she controlled was gone. Her beautiful luxury mansion belonged to the stepdaughter she hated. Her perfect country club reputation was about to be dragged through the mud in a highly publicized federal criminal trial. I watched the two of them wallow in their absolute misery. It was the exact moment of perfect poetic justice I had been planning for over a decade. I had finally avenged my father and secured his legacy from these toxic, parasitic women. Then a new sound suddenly broke through the quiet tension of the room. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail echoing from somewhere far down the affluent suburban street. I turned my head slightly toward the massive front windows, listening as the sound quickly grew louder and more distinct. Patricia lifted her head, her bloodshot eyes widening in fresh, unadulterated terror. Alicia stopped crying and scrambled to her feet, clutching the edge of the kitchen island for support as the noise pierced through the thick glass windows. The wailing sound multiplied, blending together into a chaotic, deafening chorus of emergency sirens. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the pristine white walls of the formal dining room, casting an eerie, terrifying glow over the expensive furniture. The sirens were getting rapidly closer to the house, tearing through the quiet, peaceful atmosphere of the elite gated community. They were coming directly up the long private driveway. My private security team does not tolerate threats against my life. Patricia, I said, my voice completely calm as the heavy tires screeched to a halt right outside the massive front doors. I told you they were watching the live feed. It seems they decided to call the local authorities to safely escort you off my property. The flashing red and blue emergency lights painted the pristine white walls of the kitchen in violent, shifting colors. The loud, aggressive wail of the police sirens abruptly cut off, leaving behind the heavy, terrifying sound of car doors slamming shut in the driveway. Heavy boots pounded against the concrete walkway, leading directly to the massive front entrance of the estate. Patricia realized that her time had completely run out. The police were seconds away from walking through those doors and placing her in cold steel handcuffs. The sheer, overwhelming panic finally shattered the last remaining pieces of her arrogant high society pride. She collapsed completely, falling hard onto her knees, right in the middle of the ruined kitchen. The sharp fragments of the shattered crystal vase bit into her bare legs, tearing through her expensive designer dress, but she did not even seem to feel the physical pain. She looked up at me from the floor, her face completely transformed. The dark, murderous rage that had consumed her just moments ago vanished entirely. In its place was a mask of pure, pathetic desperation. Her eyes filled with fresh, heavy tears, and her lower lip began to tremble uncontrollably. She was shifting into her ultimate survival mode, instinctively deploying the final weapon she had left in her toxic arsenal. She was going to use extreme emotional manipulation. "Morgan, please, you cannot do this to me," Patricia cried out, her voice shaking with forced theatrical agony. She reached out her manicured hands, clasping them together in a desperate, pleading gesture. "You cannot let those police officers walk into this house and arrest me. We are family, Morgan. We are supposed to protect each other from the outside world." I stood there looking down at the woman who had spent decades making my life an absolute living nightmare. I watched her lower herself to the floor, begging for mercy she never once extended to me. "You are going to send me to a federal prison," Patricia sobbed, her chest heaving dramatically. "Do you have any idea what they do to people like us in the criminal justice system, Morgan? We are Black women. The entire world is already set up against us. The system is designed to completely destroy us and lock us away in the dark. We have to stick together and protect our own flesh and blood. You cannot hand your own mother over to the police. It is a total betrayal of everything we are supposed to stand for as a family. The sheer unmitigated audacity of her words was absolutely staggering. I stared at Patricia, feeling a wave of intense cold disgust wash over my entire body. She was actually trying to weaponize our race and our gender to escape accountability for her massive corporate crimes. This was a woman who had spent her entire adult life looking down on working-class people. She lived in a sprawling luxury mansion, drank vintage champagne, and wore clothes that cost more than most people earned in a single year. She had actively participated in the systemic oppression of her own community by hoarding wealth and stepping on anyone who got in her way. But now that the police were literally knocking on the front door, she suddenly wanted to play the victim card and invoke the shared struggle of Black women in America. I remember when you called the police on a Black delivery driver just because he parked his truck too close to your pristine luxury landscaping, I reminded her, my voice devoid of any pity or compassion. You stood on this exact porch and demanded the officers arrest an innocent working man because he briefly inconvenienced your perfect suburban aesthetic. You never gave a single damn about systemic injustice when you were the one holding all the power, Patricia. You only care about the struggle now because the cold steel handcuffs are finally meant for your own wrists. Alicia let out a loud, pathetic wail from the corner of the kitchen. Please, Morgan, she whimpered, hugging her pregnant stomach tightly. Do not let them take our mother away. We can fix this quietly. We do not need to involve the authorities. I completely ignored my sobbing sister, keeping my eyes locked entirely on the desperate woman kneeling in the shattered glass. You are destroying your own family, Patricia wailed, crawling slightly forward over the broken floor. What would your father say if he could see you right now, Morgan? He would be absolutely devastated. Winston loved family more than anything else in the world. He worked his entire life to build a legacy so we could all be secure and protected. If he knew you were using his company to send his grieving widow to a federal penitentiary, he would be completely ashamed of you. You are destroying everything he worked so hard to build. The heavy pounding on the front door echoed through the large house. The local police officers were demanding entry, their loud, authoritative voices muffled by the thick, solid wood. The sound sent a fresh wave of violent trembling through Patricia's entire body. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, moving so close to her that the toes of my shoes nearly touched her bleeding knees. I looked down at her pathetic, tear-stained face, completely unfazed by her desperate emotional performance. Do not you ever dare use my father's name to justify your toxic, greedy behavior. Patricia, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet whisper that cut right through her loud, dramatic sobbing. Do not you dare try to manipulate me with fake tears and hypocritical speeches about family loyalty. You do not know the first thing about loyalty. You do not care about Black excellence or protecting our community. The only thing you have ever cared about is maintaining your own selfish, pampered existence at the expense of absolutely everyone else around you. Patricia stared up at me, her eyes wide with fear as she realized her ultimate guilt trip was having absolutely zero effect on my resolve. Before he died, my father warned me that you would do exactly this. I told her, watching the false hope drain completely from her face. He sat in my office coughing up blood and told me that the moment you were finally cornered, you would try to use his memory as a shield. He knew you would try to weaponize the concept of family to escape the legal consequences of your massive embezzlement. He told me to stand my ground and watch you beg because he knew you had absolutely no shame left in your dark, empty heart. You spent decades treating me like an unwanted stray dog in my own home. I continued, leaning down slightly so she could hear every single word clearly over the loud pounding at the door. You excluded me from family photos. You belittled my education. You told all of your wealthy friends that I was a massive disappointment simply because I refused to participate in your superficial, toxic games. You stole millions of dollars from my dying father just to buy luxury cars and designer handbags for your spoiled, useless daughter. You drained the life out of Winston Logistics and left his loyal, hardworking employees facing total financial ruin. And now you expect me to shield you from the consequences of your own criminal actions just because we share the same skin color. The heavy pounding on the front door suddenly stopped. I could hear the distinct metallic click of a key turning in the heavy brass deadbolt. My private security team was unlocking the door to let the police officers inside the house. "Please, Morgan," Patricia begged, her voice dropping into a frantic, terrified whisper as the heavy door swung open in the foyer. "I am your mother. You cannot let them take your mother away." I looked down into her desperate, panicked eyes and felt absolutely nothing but cold, hard closure. The final piece of my father's master plan was falling perfectly into place, just the way he had designed it. I leaned down until my face was only inches away from hers. I let a slow, dark smile spread across my lips as the heavy footsteps of the police officers echoed down the formal hallway, heading straight for the kitchen. "You are not my mother," I whispered, staring directly into her terrified soul. "And my father is the one who installed the cameras." Patricia stared at me with wide, terrified eyes as the heavy footsteps of the police officers echoed down the long, formal hallway. My private security guards were leading them directly toward the kitchen. I raised my left hand without looking away from Patricia's pale, sweating face, signaling the guards to halt just outside the large archway. I needed exactly 2 more minutes before the authorities dragged this wretched woman out of my house in handcuffs. I reached into the pocket of my tailored trousers and slowly pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen a few times, navigating to a secure, encrypted audio file I had kept saved for over 2 years. Patricia watched my movements with a sickening sense of dread, completely paralyzing her limbs. She was still kneeling in the shattered glass of the heavy lead crystal vase she had just tried to use as a weapon. "There is one last thing you need to hear, Patricia," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, absolute authority that filled the ruined kitchen. "There is a specific reason why my father came to me to save his legacy instead of trusting his beloved wife. I want you to listen very closely to the man you claim to love." I pressed play on the screen and turned the volume all the way up. The kitchen was deathly quiet. The only sound was Alicia's ragged breathing from the corner. Then a voice crackled through the phone speaker. It was a weak, raspy voice, but it was undeniably familiar. It was the deep, resonant timbre of my father Winston, recorded just a few days before he passed away. Patricia let out a strangled gasp and covered her mouth with both of her trembling hands. "Morgan." My father's voice echoed through the silent room, carrying a heavy burden of sorrow and regret. "If you are playing this recording, it means I am gone and Patricia has made her move. I know exactly what she is planning to do, my sweet girl. She thinks I am just a foolish old man blinded by my illness. She has been sitting by my hospital bed whispering on her phone, thinking I was asleep. She has been coordinating with shady corporate brokers to sell my logistics empire the exact second my heart stops beating." Patricia shook her head violently back and forth as if trying to physically shake the truth out of her mind. Her tears flowed faster now, not fake manipulative tears, but genuine tears of absolute horror. "She plans to take the house, Morgan, my father's recorded." Voice continued, his tone growing harder and more resolute. "She plans to forge the deed if she has to. She told her friends she was going to throw you out into the street with absolutely nothing. She called you a worthless dropout. She thought she could take everything you and I built together and use it to fund her grotesque vanity projects." I looked over at Alicia, who had suddenly stopped crying. She was staring at the phone in my hand, her eyes wide with a terrifying new realization. "I am so incredibly sorry, Morgan." My father whispered, his voice breaking with genuine emotional agony. "I am so sorry I let that woman treat you like an outsider in your own family. I was a coward. I wanted to keep the peace in the house so badly that I turned a blind eye to the emotional abuse she inflicted on you every single day. I watched her elevate Alicia while tearing you down, and I did absolutely nothing to stop it. It is my greatest failure as a father and as a man." Alicia let out a tiny broken squeak, her hands gripping her pregnant stomach. "But I see everything clearly now." My father continued, his voice, finding a sudden surge of strength and absolute conviction. "I see Patricia for the toxic, greedy parasite she truly is. I see Alicia for the spoiled, entitled fraud she has become. I know Alicia is using embezzled corporate funds to run that fake pediatric clinic. I know she married Preston just to secure her social climbing status. I know my golden child is nothing but a hollow illusion built entirely on stolen money. Alicia let out a harrowing, agonizing wail. She crawled toward me across the hardwood floor, dragging herself through the puddles of spilled water and shattered glass. Her perfect, carefully constructed reality was disintegrating completely. The father she thought adored her above all else had known the absolute truth. He knew she was a fraud, he knew she was a thief, and he despised her for it. "You are my true legacy, Morgan," my father's voice declared, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of pride and finality. "You built your own incredible success from absolutely nothing while they mocked you. You are the only one strong enough and brilliant enough to protect this family empire. I am leaving everything to you. The house, the accounts, the logistics company. It is all yours, my beautiful, brilliant daughter. Do not let them intimidate you. Do not let them use my memory to manipulate you. I give you my absolute full blessing, Morgan. Take the company, take the house, and take the trash out." The recording clicked and went completely silent. The finality of his words hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Alicia completely lost her mind. The realization that her father had chosen the dropout sister over his perfect golden child completely shattered her sanity. She collapsed flat onto her stomach on the kitchen floor, screaming and sobbing with a violent, unhinged intensity that made my skin crawl. She pounded her fists against the hardwood, wailing about how unfair it was, how she was supposed to be the favorite, how she had ruined her entire life to be the perfect daughter. She had sacrificed her marriage and her career for a father who ultimately saw her as nothing but a fraudulent parasite. Patricia was completely frozen. She was staring at the floor, her mouth hanging slightly open, her eyes completely dead and empty. The ultimate master manipulator had just been outplayed by the ghost of the husband she thought she had successfully conned. She had spent decades planning her triumphant takeover, only to realize that her victim had known about her treachery the entire time. I slipped my phone quietly back into my pocket. I looked at the weeping pregnant fraud on the floor and the completely destroyed matriarch kneeling in the glass. They had absolutely nothing left. Their money, their social status, their marriages, and now even the illusion of their father's love had been entirely ripped away. I slowly turned my head toward the large archway leading out into the formal hallway. I looked directly at the two heavily armed police officers standing there watching the entire pathetic display. I gave them a short, firm nod indicating that they could finally step into the room and finish the job. "It is time for you to leave my house, Patricia," I said, my voice ringing with absolute cold finality. The heavy front door swung open with a loud metallic creak that echoed all the way down the formal hallway. I heard the heavy tactical boots of the local police officers marching quickly across the imported marble floors. My private security team was leading them directly toward the kitchen where Patricia was currently kneeling in the shattered glass of her own ruined pride. The flashing red and blue emergency lights from the police cruisers parked outside continued to paint the pristine white walls of the kitchen in violent, shifting colors. I did not take my eyes off Patricia for a single second as the heavy footsteps grew louder and closer. "Do not move, Patricia," I said, my voice slicing clearly through the heavy, tense air. "There is one final detail you need to understand before these officers escort you off my property forever. You need to know exactly how thoroughly you just destroyed your own life." I watched her eyes dart nervously toward the hallway archway and then back to my face. She was completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of her impending arrest. "I want you to listen to me very carefully, Patricia," I continued, keeping my posture perfectly straight and completely relaxed. "My father was a far more generous and forgiving man than you ever deserved. Even after he discovered your massive corporate fraud and your endless toxic lies, he still could not bring himself to leave you completely destitute. When he sat in my office and sold me his entire logistics empire for $1, he also made me promise to establish a secret blind trust in your name." Patricia stared up at me, her tear-streaked face twisting into a pathetic mask of sudden, desperate hope. Her bloodshot eyes widened, and she let out a shaky, breathless gasp. She actually thought there was still a chance for her to survive this disaster. She genuinely believed that somewhere deep down, she still had a safety net waiting to catch her when she fell. It was a modest monthly stipend, I explained, watching her hang on to my every word. It was absolutely not enough to fund your lavish country club lifestyle or pay for your expensive luxury vacations to Europe. It would never cover your endless designer wardrobes or the massive lease payments for Alicia's completely bankrupt pediatric clinic. But it was more than enough to pay for a quiet, comfortable apartment in the suburbs. It was enough to keep the heat running and keep warm food on your table for the rest of your natural life. He wanted to make sure his widow would never have to literally starve in the streets, even after everything you did to completely betray his trust and destroy his business. Patricia let out a loud, sobbing sigh of relief. Her shoulders slumped, and she pressed her trembling hands against her chest, as if she had just been granted a miraculous pardon. But my father was also a deeply pragmatic and realistic man. I said, my voice turning incredibly cold and ruthless, completely crushing that brief, pathetic flicker of hope. He knew exactly how incredibly greedy you were. He knew your massive, unhinged ego would never be satisfied with a quiet, modest life in a normal neighborhood. He knew you would always want more power and more control. He knew you would eventually come after me the exact second you realized his personal estate was completely empty and devoid of any real assets. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, crossing my arms over my chest as I looked down at her pathetic form on the floor. So he explicitly ordered my elite legal team to attach one ironclad absolute condition to the blind trust, I told her. We called it the kill switch. The condition was incredibly simple, Patricia. You would automatically receive that modest monthly stipend until the very day you died, provided you never attempted to lay claim to my primary residence. If you ever stepped foot on my personal property and tried to physically take this house from me, the trust would instantly and permanently dissolve. I watched her eyes widen in absolute, pure, unadulterated horror as the devastating reality of her own actions finally caught up with her. I watched the blood drain completely from her face, leaving her looking like a pale, terrifying ghost as she remembered the events of the afternoon. Think about exactly what you did 2 hours ago, Patricia, I commanded, letting a dark, victorious smile touch my lips. You marched through my front doors like a conquering queen. You completely ignored my private security guards. You threw your expensive designer bag onto my custom living room sofa. You stood right there in my grand foyer and aggressively demanded the keys to my house. You looked me dead in the eyes and proudly declared that you were taking full, absolute ownership of my home. You literally threatened to throw me out into the street. Alicia began to weep uncontrollably from her spot on the floor, realizing that her mother's supreme arrogance had literally cost them their absolute final lifeline. Alicia hugged her pregnant stomach tightly, rocking back and forth as the sheer magnitude of their complete financial ruin settled heavily over her shoulders. She knew her mother had just thrown away their only chance at survival simply because she wanted to bully me one last time. The exact moment you threw your bag on my couch and demanded my keys, you triggered the kill switch. I stated, my voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. Because you could not control your toxic greed and your desperate, pathetic need to dominate me, you lost the only safety net my father left for you. The live stream that my legal team has been watching downtown captured every single word of your hostile takeover attempt. They documented your exact threats. They recorded you demanding the legal deed to my house. Patricia began to shake her head side to side, letting out a long, continuous, miserable moan. They executed the kill switch protocol 20 minutes ago, while you were busy threatening to smash my kitchen to pieces, I explained, watching the absolute defeat wash over her entire body. The trust has been permanently revoked, Patricia. The funds have been completely liquidated, and every single penny has already been transferred and donated to a local charity in my father's name. You are officially penniless, Patricia. You do not have a monthly stipend. You do not have a secret trust fund. You do not have a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. You do not have a country club membership or a rich son-in-law to save you. You have absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back and the broken glass scattered around your bleeding knees. 2 large local police officers finally stepped through the wide archway and entered the bright kitchen. They stopped in their tracks and looked at the shattered crystal vase scattered across the marble floor. They looked at Alicia, crying hysterically against the luxury refrigerator. Then they looked down at Patricia, kneeling on the ground looking like a completely deranged feral animal. "Mom, please step away from the broken glass and show us your hands," one of the officers ordered, resting his heavy hand cautiously on his utility belt. Patricia did not even acknowledge the police officer standing right next to her. She just stared up at me, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a suffocating fish pulled from the water. "It is all gone," she whispered, her voice completely devoid of any life or energy. "Everything is gone." "Yes, Patricia," I replied, watching the officer step forward to firmly grab her arms. "Everything is absolutely gone." The moment the heavy hands of the police officers closed around Patricia's silk-clad arms, a sudden and violent shift occurred in her demeanor. The hollow, empty look of total defeat instantly vanished from her eyes. In the blink of an eye, she completely transformed from a broken, ruined woman into a terrified, helpless victim. She let out a loud, theatrical shriek and violently wrenched her shoulders back, attempting to pull away from the officer's grasp. She threw her head back and began to sob with such intense, raw agony that anyone who did not know her true nature would have believed her heart was actually breaking. "Officers, thank God you are finally here!" Patricia wailed, her voice trembling with perfect manufactured terror. "You have to help us. This woman is completely out of her mind. She broke into my home while my pregnant daughter and I were resting. She is a violent intruder, and she is having a severe psychotic mental breakdown. She just shattered my priceless crystal vase and started screaming absolute nonsense about trusts and companies." Alicia immediately picked up on her mother's desperate cue. She pushed herself up off the wet floor using the refrigerator for support and leaned heavily against the kitchen island. She cradled her swollen stomach with both hands and let out a pathetic, whimpering cry. "Please," Officer Alicia sobbed, forcing large, heavy tears down her pale cheeks. "This woman is my estranged sister. She has a long history of severe mental instability. She has been stalking us and threatening us for months because she is insanely jealous of my life and my marriage. We are terrified of her. She just completely snapped and attacked my mother unprovoked. You have to arrest her before she hurts my unborn baby." The two police officers immediately froze, their expressions shifting from authoritative command to deep confusion. They looked at the shattered glass scattered across the expensive marble floor and the puddles of water pooling near the custom cabinets. They looked at the weeping, wealthy older woman covered in expensive jewelry and the terrified pregnant woman clutching her stomach in the corner. It was a perfectly executed emotional manipulation designed specifically to prey on the protective instincts of law enforcement. The lead officer slowly released Patricia's arm and turned his full attention toward me. He rested his hand cautiously near his utility belt and took a slow, deliberate step in my direction. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to step back and slowly explain exactly what is going on here," the lead officer said, his voice thick with heavy suspicion and warning. "I need to see your identification right now, and you need to tell me why you are standing inside this residence." Patricia let out a loud, dramatic sob of relief, hiding her face in her manicured hands. I could clearly see the slight upward curve of her lips hiding behind her fingers. She genuinely thought her little performance had worked. She thought she could simply cry and lie her way out of total, absolute destruction, just like she had done every single day of her miserable, pampered life. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or attempt to argue with the sobbing women. I maintained my perfectly straight posture and kept my expression completely blank and composed. I knew this exact moment was coming. My father and I had spent hours preparing for every possible variable, including Patricia's inevitable desperate lies to the authorities. We knew she would try to play the victim the exact second she was cornered. I reached slowly and deliberately into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. The lead officer tensed slightly, watching my hands with sharp, intense focus. "I am simply retrieving my identification and the legal documents proving my absolute ownership of this estate, officer," I said, my voice perfectly calm and remarkably steady. I slowly pulled out a thick, crisp envelope made of heavy parchment paper and handed it directly to the lead officer. I then retrieved my state-issued driver's license and placed it carefully on top of the envelope. The officer looked down at my identification and then opened the heavy envelope. The kitchen was completely silent except for the dramatic sniffling coming from Alicia. Inside that envelope, you will find the legally binding and fully notarized deed to this property, I explained, watching the officer's eyes scan the heavy legal text. The deed was transferred into my name exclusively, and it has already been officially recorded with the city and the county clerk's office. You will also find a secondary document attached right behind the deed. It is a preemptive court-approved restraining order that I personally filed and had signed by a superior court judge early this morning. Patricia suddenly stopped crying. Her hands dropped slowly away from her face, and her eyes locked onto the thick stack of papers in the officer's hands. She knew exactly what a restraining order meant, but she had absolutely no idea I had been calculating enough to secure one before she even set foot on my property. The blood drained from her face as the horrifying reality of my absolute preparation finally crushed her last remaining hope. That restraining order explicitly prohibits Patricia and Alicia from coming within 500 feet of me or my primary residence. I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy, tense air like a sharp, icy blade. The documents clearly state that they are entirely unauthorized to be on this property under any circumstances. They do not live here. They have no legal claim to this estate. They are currently trespassing on my private property, and they have just willfully violated a direct order from a superior court judge. The lead officer spent a long, meticulous moment reviewing the thick legal documents. He checked the official government seals, the witness signatures, and the stamped dates. He compared the exact address on the deed to the address printed clearly on my driver's license. He read the explicit terms of the restraining order and noted the judge's fresh signature from that very morning. The tension in the massive kitchen was so incredibly thick, it felt like it might physically suffocate us all. Slowly, the lead officer folded the documents and placed them carefully back into the thick parchment envelope. He handed the envelope and my identification back to me with a respectful, curt nod. His demeanor had completely shifted in an instant. The suspicion and warning were entirely gone, replaced by a cold, hard professionalism directed entirely at the two women who had just lied directly to his face. He turned his back on me and faced Patricia. The second officer immediately stepped up right beside him, perfectly mirroring his rigid, authoritative stance. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, her hands fluttering nervously in front of her chest. "Officer, you have to understand," she stammered, her voice completely devoid of its previous theatrical confidence. "Those papers must be forged. My husband would never allow this. We are the true victims here." "Ma'am," the lead officer interrupted, his voice booming through the kitchen with absolute zero tolerance for her desperate lies. "I have personally verified these documents, and they are completely legitimate. This woman is the sole legal owner of this property, and she holds an active, full protective order against both of you. You have lied to police officers, and you are currently committing a crime just by standing inside this house." Alicia let out a terrified squeak and backed further into the corner, pressing her spine against the cold stainless steel refrigerator. Patricia looked wildly around the room, completely trapped like a cornered animal, realizing that her final masterful manipulation had failed spectacularly. The lead officer placed his hand firmly on his utility belt and stared directly into Patricia's wide, panicked eyes. "I am going to make this incredibly simple for you," the officer stated, his voice dropping into a deadly serious tone. "I am giving you and your daughter exactly 60 seconds to vacate these premises immediately. If you are not walking out that front door by the time I finish counting, you will both be placed under arrest and taken downtown for criminal trespassing and violating a direct court order." The lead officer crossed his thick arms over his heavy chest and stared down at his tactical black wristwatch. The steady mechanical ticking of the second hand seemed to echo through the massive kitchen, vibrating against the pristine marble countertops. 55 seconds left, the officer stated, his voice completely flat and devoid of any human sympathy. Patricia remained frozen on the wet floor, her mouth opening and closing silently. She looked exactly like a fish suffocating on a dry dock. The flawless matriarch who had spent the last 2 decades treating everyone around her like disposable garbage was finally realizing that her reign of terror was officially over. She turned her desperate, panicked eyes toward the second police officer. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking pathetically. "You do not understand what is happening here. I am Winston Blackwood's widow. I am a highly respected member of this wealthy community. You cannot simply throw me out into the cold street like a common criminal." 45 seconds, the lead officer interrupted, not even bothering to look up from the face of his watch. Alicia let out a sudden blood-curdling scream from the far corner of the room. It was not a scream of anger or frustration, but a harrowing sound of pure, unadulterated terror. She was staring down at her expensive smartphone, her hands shaking so violently that she nearly dropped the sleek device directly into a puddle of water. Her face had gone completely gray and her breathing had become dangerously shallow. "He left me," Alicia shrieked, pulling at her blonde hair with her free hand. "Preston left me, Morgan. He just sent me a text message from his corporate lawyer's office. He says the federal authorities just raided the pediatric clinic and seized all the financial records. He knows absolutely everything about the embezzled corporate funds. He emptied our personal joint accounts this morning, and he is filing for an emergency divorce. He says he is not going to a federal penitentiary for my sloppy crimes." I looked down at my sobbing pregnant sister and felt absolutely nothing but a deep, profound emptiness. For years, she had paraded around in designer clothes funded entirely by money she had stolen from our dying father's logistics empire. She had built her entire superficial existence on a dark foundation of massive criminal fraud. Her husband was a calculated social climber who had only married her for her unlimited access to the Blackwood family fortune. The exact second Preston realized the money was completely gone and the federal agents were finally closing in, he abandoned her without a single ounce of hesitation. Alicia dropped her phone onto the floor and collapsed entirely. The glamorous golden child who had spent her entire life mocking my education and my relentless work ethic was now reduced to a weeping, pathetic mess. She began to drag herself across the wet hardwood floor, moving directly toward my expensive leather shoes. "Morgan, please," Alicia begged, her voice pitching into a frantic, terrified whine. "You cannot do this to me. You are my sister. We share the exact same blood. You cannot just let me lose everything I have ever worked for. Preston took all the money. The clinic is completely gone. The house is going to be seized by the bank tomorrow morning. I am pregnant, Morgan. I do not have anywhere else to go." 30 seconds, the lead officer announced, stepping slightly closer to the center of the ruined room. I stared down at the broken woman, clawing desperately at the hem of my tailored trousers. She looked absolutely pathetic, kneeling in the spilled water and the shattered crystal glass. This was the exact same sister who had happily participated in my emotional destruction for years. She had laughed out loud when Patricia locked me out of the main house during holidays. She had smiled brightly when they called me a worthless dropout in front of our extended family. Now that the severe legal consequences of her own massive greed were finally crashing down on her head, she suddenly wanted to play the sacred family card. "I will do anything!" Morgan, Alicia sobbed, wiping a messy mixture of tears and makeup from her pale face. "I will clean your massive house. I will scrub your hardwood floors on my hands and knees. Just please give me access to the blind trust fund. Just give me a tiny, small piece of the logistics company. I do not know how to be poor, Morgan. I do not know how to live like normal working-class people. Please, I am begging you to show me some basic human mercy." I slowly pulled my leg back, forcing her to release her desperate, pathetic grip on my trousers. I looked directly into her terrified, swollen red eyes. "Then you better learn how to use a cash register, Alicia," I said, my voice dropping into a cold, deadly whisper that cut right through her loud, hysterical sobbing. "I hear the local Starbucks is currently hiring shift supervisors. Maybe if you work hard enough, you can actually afford to buy your own designer coffee instead of stealing millions of dollars from dying men to fund your fake vanity clinic." Alicia let out a breathless, choking gasp, as if I had just physically kicked her right in the chest. She slumped back heavily against the kitchen island, completely broken and entirely defeated. 15 seconds, the lead officer warned, his hand moving deliberately toward the heavy steel handcuffs resting on his dark leather belt. "It is time to leave the property, ladies." Patricia suddenly let out a feral, unhinged growl from her spot on the floor. The harsh reality that she was actually going to be escorted out of the grand house like a common street criminal completely shattered the last fragile pieces of her sanity. Her eyes darted wildly around the bright kitchen until they landed directly on the sleek black leather briefcase resting on the granite counter. It was the exact briefcase where I had just placed the official property deed and the signed restraining order. In a sudden burst of violent, desperate energy, Patricia lunged forward. She scrambled up from the wet floor, completely ignoring the sharp glass slicing deep into her bleeding knees, and threw her entire body weight toward the tall counter. She let out a deranged, screaming battle cry, reaching her manicured hands out aggressively to grab the heavy briefcase. She clearly thought that if she could somehow violently destroy the physical documents, she could magically reverse the absolute reality of her total destruction. She never even made it past the kitchen island. The second police officer reacted with lightning speed. He stepped swiftly forward and grabbed Patricia's extended arm, twisting it firmly behind her back in one fluid, practiced motion. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic shriek of physical pain as the side of her face was slammed hard against the cold marble countertop. "Let go of me, you classless thug!" Patricia screamed, kicking her expensive shoes wildly in the air. "I am Patricia Blackwood. I own this massive estate. I will have your badge for this outrage. I will sue this entire city for millions." The distinct metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the quiet room. The officer secured her wrists tightly together, completely neutralizing her pathetic, desperate physical attack. "Patricia Blackwood, you are currently under arrest for criminal trespassing, violating a protective order, and attempting to assault a police officer." The lead cop stated, his voice carrying absolute, unquestionable authority. "You have the right to remain completely silent, and I strongly suggest you start using it immediately." They hauled her roughly up from the counter. Patricia was hyperventilating, her perfect hair hanging in messy, sweaty clumps across her face. The dark mascara was running heavily down her cheeks in thick lines, making her look exactly like the wicked, evil monster she had always been on the inside. She locked her furious, bloodshot eyes on me as the two officers began to drag her forcibly toward the formal hallway. "You will burn in hell for this, Morgan," she shrieked, her voice echoing violently down the long, open corridor. "Winston never actually loved you. You were always just a massive disappointment to him. You will never be a true Blackwood." I stood perfectly still, watching them drag the screaming, thrashing matriarch out of my kitchen. Her loud, pathetic, empty threats grew fainter and fainter as they pulled her through the grand foyer and out the heavy wooden front doors. The lead officer turned his attention back to Alicia, who was still weeping silently on the wet floor. "Mom," the officer said firmly, but with a very slight fraction of human pity in his deep voice. "You need to stand up and walk out that door right now, or you will be leaving in metal cuffs just like your mother." Alicia slowly pushed herself up from the floor. She did not look at me. She did not say another word. She kept her head bowed, entirely hiding her face, as she shuffled slowly and miserably out of the kitchen. The glamorous golden child was walking completely alone out into the cold, dark reality of her completely ruined life. I watched Alicia drag her feet across the expensive imported marble floor of the grand foyer. Her shoulders were completely hunched forward, and her arms were wrapped tightly around her pregnant stomach. The sheer arrogance she had paraded through those massive front doors just a few hours ago had entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, broken shell of a woman. She looked incredibly small and pathetic as she reached down to pick up the cheap brown moving boxes she had so confidently brought inside to pack up my belongings. She had marched in here believing she was going to claim my sanctuary for herself, but now she was leaving with absolutely nothing but cardboard and disgrace. Behind her, the heavy, tactical boots of the two police officers thumped rhythmically against the hardwood. They were frog-marching Patricia right out of my kitchen and down the long, formal hallway. Her arms were twisted awkwardly behind her back, and the cold steel handcuffs clicked and rattled with every single frantic step she took. She was stumbling forward, her designer dress stained with water and her own blood from the shattered crystal vase. Patricia kept trying to plant her expensive heels into the floor to slow down the humiliating procession, but the officers simply pushed her forward with unwavering professional force. She let out weak, pathetic whimpers with every step completely drained of her usual toxic venom. I followed closely behind them, my hands resting casually in the pockets of my tailored trousers. The air in the house suddenly felt incredibly light and breathable. For my entire life, these two toxic women had absolutely suffocated me with their endless demands, their cruel psychological games, and their relentless social climbing. They had treated my father like a walking bank account and treated me like an unwanted pest. Now they were being physically ejected from my property like common street criminals, and I was going to watch every single second of their ultimate departure. We reached the massive double front doors. The evening air was crisp and cool as the late officer pushed the heavy mahogany doors wide open. The flashing red and blue emergency lights from the 3 police cruisers parked carelessly in my circular driveway immediately blinded us. The violent strobing colors illuminated the perfectly manicured landscaping, the towering oak trees, and the expansive, pristine lawns. But the emergency lights also illuminated something far more devastating for Patricia and Alicia. The loud wailing sirens and the sudden influx of armed police officers had drawn the absolute undivided attention of the entire exclusive neighborhood. This was a highly restricted gated community filled with wealthy venture capitalists, old money heirs, and aggressive socialites. These were the exact elite people Patricia and Alicia had spent their entire pathetic lives trying to desperately impress. They had hosted lavish garden parties and extravagant charity galas just to earn the approval of these specific people. I stepped out onto the expansive front porch and looked down at the street. At least a dozen of my extremely wealthy neighbors were standing at the edge of their pristine driveways or lingering on the perfectly paved sidewalks. Eleanor Vance, the president of the local country club, was standing there with her arms crossed over her cashmere sweater, staring openly at the unfolding disaster. The Harrison brothers were standing near their luxury sports cars, pointing directly at Patricia. I even saw Beatrice Sterling, the most notorious gossip in the entire zip code, holding her smartphone up to record the entire humiliating spectacle. Every single one of them was watching the great, flawless Patricia Blackwood being dragged out of a house in heavy metal handcuffs. Patricia let out a horrified, strangled gasp when she saw the large, captivated audience. The absolute worst nightmare of her entire superficial existence was happening right in front of her country club peers. She immediately dropped her chin to her chest, desperately trying to hide her tear-stained, ruined face behind her tangled blonde hair. She tried to physically turn her body away from the staring neighbors, but the officers held her firmly in place, guiding her forcefully down the wide brick steps. She let out a soft, agonizing wail of pure social terror, knowing that she could never ever show her face in this city again. Alicia was trembling so violently that she nearly dropped the cheap cardboard moving boxes right onto the concrete walkway. She stumbled down the steps behind her mother, looking absolutely terrified and completely ashamed. She tried to hide her face behind one of the brown boxes, shrinking away from the piercing, judgmental gazes of the neighborhood elite. She knew that by tomorrow morning, every single person in their exclusive social circle would know exactly what had happened. They would know about the embezzled funds, the federal raids, the sudden divorce, and the humiliating police escort. Their carefully curated, flawless reputation was instantly and permanently obliterated. The lead officer opened the back door of the main police cruiser and firmly pushed Patricia inside. She crumpled into the back seat, her head hanging low, her spirit entirely broken by the sheer weight of her own catastrophic failures. The heavy car door slammed shut with a loud metallic thud, sealing her fate. Alicia stood awkwardly on the edge of the driveway, clutching her moving boxes with nowhere to go and absolutely no one to call. Her rich husband had abandoned her, and her mother was currently sitting in the back of a squad car. One of the officers pointed toward the street, instructing her to vacate the private property line immediately. She slowly turned and began the long, miserable walk down the long, winding driveway, her head hung in total, absolute disgrace as the neighbors watched her every single step. I stood at the very top of my front porch, breathing in the cool evening air. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the shiny brass spare key that Patricia had aggressively demanded earlier that afternoon. The heavy police cruiser slowly pulled out of my driveway, its red and blue lights still flashing silently against the darkening sky. I watched the car carry my toxic stepmother away toward the local precinct and a very dark, miserable future behind cold iron bars. I tossed the heavy brass key high into the air, watching it glint brightly in the fading evening sunlight. I felt the solid weight of it land perfectly in the palm of my right hand and let a genuine, slow smile spread completely across my face. The trash had finally been taken out. The heavy mahogany front door clicked shut behind me with a solid, satisfying thud. The sudden silence that immediately swallowed the grand foyer was completely different from the tense, heavy quiet that had occupied my house just an hour ago. This silence was pure and breathable and absolutely perfect. It was the beautiful, peaceful sound of complete victory. I leaned my back against the thick wood of the door and let my eyes wander across the vaulted ceilings and the sweeping curved staircase. The house was finally mine in every possible sense of the word. The toxic parasitic energy that Patricia and Alicia had dragged inside with their cheap designer bags and their endless cruel entitlement was completely eradicated. I walked slowly across the imported marble floors, letting the sharp rhythmic clicking of my heels echo through the empty space. I moved back into the kitchen, where the remnants of Patricia's pathetic, final temper tantrum were still scattered across the room. The shattered pieces of the priceless crystal vase glittered violently under the warm, recessed lighting. A pool of water was steadily drying near the base of the custom stainless steel refrigerator. Normally, a mess like this would have instantly triggered my desire to clean and organize, but tonight it looked like a beautiful abstract painting. It was a physical monument to the exact moment my wicked stepmother finally broke. I stepped carefully around the sharp, jagged shards of glass and made my way toward the climate-controlled wine refrigerator built seamlessly into the dark wooden cabinetry. I opened the sleek glass door and ran my fingers slowly over the smooth, chilled bottles resting on the wooden racks. My father had curated this entire collection over decades of his incredibly successful life. He had taught me exactly how to appreciate the deep, complex notes of a properly aged vintage. I selected a heavy, dark bottle of a rare French red that he had specifically saved for a highly significant occasion. There was absolutely no occasion more significant than the total purification of our family legacy. I retrieved a delicate, long-stemmed crystal glass from the upper cabinet and used a heavy silver corkscrew to smoothly extract the cork. The rich, earthy aroma of dark berries and aged oak instantly filled the air around me. I poured the dark crimson liquid, watching it swirl and settle perfectly in the elegant glass. Holding the expensive wine, I walked slowly out of the ruined kitchen and glided down the long hallway toward my private study. The thick plush carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps as I entered the massive room lined entirely with dark mahogany bookshelves and rich leather furniture. I walked directly over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling manicured backyard and the dense line of tall pine trees marking the edge of my private estate. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine, letting the rich, complex flavors wash over my tongue. It tasted like absolute freedom. I stood there bathed in the soft, silvery glow of the evening moonlight, reflecting deeply on the sheer magnitude of what had just transpired. For years, I had been forced to stand silently in the shadows, watching Patricia and Alicia systematically drain the life and the wealth right out of my brilliant father. I had endured their endless petty insults, their targeted psychological abuse, and their pathetic social climbing games. I had played the role of the quiet, obedient daughter while silently studying every single one of their glaring weaknesses. They genuinely believed that wealth and power were things you could simply bully out of other people. They never understood that true power requires incredible patience and absolute flawless execution. The money they had lost today was entirely secondary to the real prize. The logistics empire, the massive bank accounts, the real estate properties, they were all just tools used to achieve my ultimate goal. The true validation came from the profound execution of perfect absolute justice. I had not just taken their stolen money away, I had completely destroyed the false reality they had built their entire toxic identities upon. I had ripped their wicked roots completely out of the ground, making absolutely certain that they could never ever grow back and poison my life again. My father could finally rest in total peace, knowing that his legacy was securely back in the hands of the only person who actually respected it. A sudden soft buzzing sound broke through my quiet, peaceful reflection. My smartphone was vibrating steadily against the polished surface of my heavy oak desk. I walked slowly across the room and picked up the device. The bright screen illuminated the dark study, revealing a new email notification marked urgent. I tapped the screen and opened the message. The sender name made a sharp, dark laugh escape my chest. It was Preston. Alicia's cowardly, opportunistic husband had not wasted a single second after abandoning his pregnant wife. The email was a long, pathetic, rambling masterpiece of pure, desperate groveling. Preston wrote that he had been completely blind to his wife's disgusting criminal activities. He claimed he was a victim of Patricia's endless toxic manipulation, and that he was absolutely horrified to discover the massive extent of their corporate embezzlement. He begged me to understand that he had immediately filed for divorce the exact second he found out the truth. He swore that his loyalty had always secretly remained with my father and the true Blackwood legacy. Then came the ultimate punchline. He actually had the sheer unmitigated audacity to beg for a senior executive position at the logistics firm I now fully controlled. He promised he would work tirelessly around the clock to prove his worth and help me rebuild the exact company his wife had just tried to destroy. I stared down at the glowing screen, completely mesmerized by the absolute lack of shame. Preston was nothing but another spineless parasite, desperately trying to attach himself to a new host, now that his old one was completely dead. He genuinely thought his pathetic betrayal of Alicia would somehow earn him a seat at my table. He thought throwing the mother of his unborn child directly under the bus would magically erase years of his own greedy, complicit behavior. I did not even bother typing out a single word in response. I simply tapped the small trash can icon at the top of the screen, instantly deleting his desperate, pathetic plea from my inbox. I navigated directly to my security settings and permanently blocked his email address and his personal phone number. He was completely erased from my existence in exactly 3 simple screen taps. I set the phone face down on the heavy oak desk and picked up my crystal glass of red wine. I walked back over to the towering windows and looked out across the vast, beautiful landscape of my empire. The dark night had fully settled over the estate, covering the world in a quiet, protective blanket of shadows. The toxic parasites were entirely gone. The glorious, pristine future was entirely mine. I took one final slow sip of the perfect wine and let a genuine happy smile light up my face. Total, absolute peace had finally been achieved. True wealth is never defined by stolen money or fake social status. It is built through relentless hard work and unwavering integrity. The ultimate lesson here is that toxic manipulation and blinding greed will always lead to a spectacular downfall. You can never build a beautiful life on a foundation of cruel lies. Standing up to abusive family members is not an act of vengeance. It is a vital step to reclaim your own peace. Please share your stories in the comments below, and remember to hit subscribe. If you ever cut ties with bad relatives to protect your future,